Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I was standing in the backyard when it happened. It was around 7:30, early spring. That kind of chilly dusk where the air smells like damp soil and wood smoke. I'd gone out there just to get away from my phone for a bit. My girlfriend, Elise, was inside finishing a work call, and I remember thinking the sky looked unusually clear. You could see almost every star even though we were still inside the small town limits. I live in Port Orchard, Washington, near the water. Most nights we get a haze from the bay, but that evening it was crisp. There's a small flight path that runs over our neighborhood. We get a lot of commercial planes from SeaTac passing over at cruising altitude, just quiet little white dots sliding across the sky. I've watched them 100 times while having a smoke or watering the plants. I was leaning against the fence when I noticed one moving from west to east. Nothing weird about it at first, just steady, a faint white blink every couple seconds. I was kind of zoning out, following it between the branches. Then, right when it reached this open patch of sky above my neighbor's maple tree, it just stopped. Like, stopped. No flicker. No fade. Just perfectly motionless. At first, I thought it was an illusion, like maybe it was coming directly toward me, so it only looked stationary. But the blink stopped too. The little rhythmic light that planes always have just quit. I kept watching, waiting for it to resume its path. After maybe 10 seconds, I felt that weird pressure you get when something isn't behaving the way it's supposed to. My brain was trying to force it back into something normal, like maybe it was a helicopter that turned its lights off or I'd misjudged the distance. But helicopters don't fly that high and they don't just hang perfectly still without any sound. The longer I stared, the more wrong it felt. The object wasn't quite white anymore, more like a dull silver, but it wasn't reflecting anything. The sky around it had a faint halo, almost like heat shimmer, but the air was cold. I remember muttering something like, "What the hell?" under my breath, and that was when it started to rotate. Not turn, not tilt, rotate, slowly, on its axis. It was so smooth it didn't even feel mechanical. The kind of movement you'd expect from a reflection on water, not a solid object in the sky. It made half a turn, paused, then completed the rotation. When it was upright again, it blinked once. Not a light exactly, just this brief white flare, and vanished. I don't mean it shot off. I mean it was just gone. The sky where it had been was totally empty. My eyes went wide. I blinked a few times, but there was nothing. No afterglow, no sound. I stayed there for a while, trying to spot any plane lights, but the whole area looked darker now. The stars seemed dimmer, like the contrast had changed somehow. I felt weirdly dizzy, like I'd stood up too fast. I finally went inside and told Elise what I saw. She kind of smiled and said maybe it was a satellite or a drone. I said drones don't fly at 30,000 feet and satellites don't stop midair. She shrugged, like she didn't really want to talk about it. She shrugged. I let it go for a while, but later that night, around midnight, I couldn't sleep. I went back outside. The temperature had dropped a lot. My breath came out in fog. The sky had clouded over a bit, but there was still a clear gap toward the south. I scanned for anything unusual, half hoping I'd just imagined it earlier. That's when I noticed a faint flickering reflection on my metal gutter, even though there weren't any visible light sources. I turned toward where it was coming from and saw something dim through the haze. Not bright, just like a faint glow behind thin cloud. It was in the same patch of sky. The light was pulsing irregularly, maybe every 4 or 5 seconds, but it wasn't flashing like an aircraft beacon. It was more like the brightness was breathing in and out. Every time it faded, I thought it was gone, but then it would swell up again, just enough to see the outline of something round behind it. I stood perfectly still, trying not to blink too much. I was scared, but it wasn't that kind of jumpy fear. It was the slow, sinking kind that crawls through you. I could feel my pulse in my neck. After maybe a minute, the glow began to drift, very slowly, downward. I thought maybe a searchlight was shining through cloud cover, but the movement didn't match. It didn't spread or scatter like light does when it passes through mist. It stayed solid, confined, like it had edges. Then it stopped again, hung there for a second, and, same as before, vanished. When it went dark, everything else did too. The porch light I'd left on flickered and died. The motion sensor light over the garage went out. Even my phone screen dimmed for a second before recovering. I felt static on my skin. Every hair stood up. I didn't move for maybe 30 seconds. Then, just as I was about to go back inside, I noticed something even stranger. The air smelled metallic, like hot wires or blood. The lights came back on by themselves a moment later. Everything looked totally normal, but the smell lingered. I went inside, locked the door, and sat at the kitchen table for a while. My dog Lucy came over and started whining, pacing by the back door. When I touched her collar, it was warm, noticeably warm, like it had been sitting near a heater. That detail stuck with me because the air inside the house was cool. The next day, I checked the flight radar app I use sometimes. There were 2 planes listed as passing roughly in that direction at that time, but their altitudes didn't match what I saw, and both were commercial flights bound for Anchorage and Vancouver. Neither one would have been stationary. Later that week, my neighbor, Brian, mentioned something offhand while we were taking out trash. He said his kids had been out playing basketball that same evening, and they swore a star fell up instead of down. He laughed when he said it, thought they were just goofing around, but it made my stomach drop. I didn't tell him what I saw. A few nights after that, I was walking Lucy down the street around 10. The sky was cloudy again, but thin enough that you could still see the brighter stars through gaps. I glanced up automatically, and for just a split second, I thought I saw that same dull silver glint, like a pinpoint reflection between clouds. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was nothing, that I was probably just looking for it. But when I got home, I noticed my watch was off by 6 minutes. I know that sounds minor, but it's one of those atomic sync ones that adjusts automatically every night. It had never been wrong before. It wasn't losing time. It was ahead. The battery's fine. Still is. I haven't had another experience like that since, but I can't go outside at night without checking the sky now. I keep half expecting to see that frozen plane again, suspended like it's waiting for me to notice. I've replayed it in my head 100 times. The silence, the rotation, the way it blinked out. There's no sound explanation I can think of that fits. It was just there, then it wasn't. And somehow that felt deliberate. It happened last summer, late July. I lived just outside of Boone, North Carolina, a few miles past where the streetlights stop and the road narrows to 1 lane. The area is rural but not completely isolated, mostly scattered houses tucked behind trees, with long gravel driveways and dogs that bark at every passing car. That night I took my dog Rosie for a walk around 10:30. It was warm but not muggy, one of those clear mountain nights where the air feels thinner than usual. No clouds, no moon, just thousands of stars. I remember thinking how quiet it already was compared to town, just the usual chorus of crickets, frogs from the creek, and the occasional hum of a car way off on Highway 105. I had my headlamp on, mostly for visibility to passing cars, and Rosie's leash light blinking red. We usually walk about half a mile down our road, turn around at the old cattle gate, and head back. About 10 minutes in, I started noticing how still the air felt. It wasn't windy, but it wasn't calm either. It just had this strange, heavy stillness, like before a thunderstorm, even though the sky was perfectly clear. Rosie kept pausing, sniffing the air, her ears twitching like she was catching a sound I couldn't. Then, all at once, everything went silent. I mean, literally silent. The crickets stopped. The frogs stopped. Even the faint rustle of the trees froze. I didn't hear my own footsteps, not even the gravel crunching under my shoes. I could see my feet moving, but there was no sound. The leash jangled against my wrist, but I heard nothing. I stopped walking and turned off my headlamp just to see if it was some weird audio glitch from the light's battery or something stupid like that. But the silence didn't change. It was total, suffocating silence. Rosie froze beside me, completely still, sat tail down. She didn't bark, didn't growl. She just stood rigid, staring down the road. Her breathing slowed, and I swear even that made no sound. The silence lasted maybe 5 seconds. It doesn't sound long when I say it, but in the moment it felt drawn out, like time stretched around it. Then suddenly everything came back at once. Crickets, frogs, distant cars, the sound of wind in the leaves, all in perfect sync. I remember exhaling hard, realizing I'd been holding my breath. Rosie let out a soft whine like she was confused too. I turned the headlamp back on and we kept walking a little further, though my stomach felt tight, like I shouldn't be there. At the gate, I turned around to head back. That's when I noticed the stars looked different. Not brighter, not dimmer, just wrong. I know that sounds weird, but I've lived in the mountains my whole life, and I'm used to the night sky. I recognize the Big Dipper, Orion, Cassiopeia. They've always been in the same spots relative to the horizon. But now, the Dipper looked shifted, lower, tilted slightly. The other constellations didn't line up right either. It was like someone had rearranged them. I told myself it was my angle, or maybe the Earth's rotation making me think they'd moved. But something about it didn't sit right. The sky didn't look rotated. It looked redrawn. Halfway back, I noticed the crickets had stopped again. Just once, for maybe a second or two, like a hiccup in sound. This time, the silence didn't last, but it was enough to make Rosie stop walking again. When we got close to my driveway, the motion light on my garage flicked on, and I swear the glow hit something reflective up the road. A faint glint, like metal, maybe 50 yards ahead. But when I turned the headlamp toward it, there was nothing, just the road disappearing into dark. Back inside, Rosie wouldn't settle. She paced around the living room, whining softly, pausing by the windows. I turned off the lights to calm her and glanced outside. The stars still looked wrong, like someone had pulled them just a few degrees off from where they should have been. I decided to check a stargazing app on my phone. I pointed it up toward the Dipper, but the app's overlay didn't match what I saw. According to it, the constellation should have been higher and slightly east. I thought maybe my phone's compass was off, so I recalibrated it. Still didn't match. I did the same with Orion and Cassiopeia, none of them lined up. The app acted like I was standing somewhere else entirely. Around midnight, I gave up trying to make sense of it. I took Rosie out one last time before bed. The stars had shifted back to where they belonged, or at least they looked normal again. The air felt lighter, like that heavy stillness had finally lifted. I didn't think much more about it until the next morning. I stepped outside with my coffee, and my neighbor Tom, who lives down the road about a quarter mile, was loading his truck. I called over and asked if he'd been outside late last night. He said yeah, his dog had been barking like crazy around 10:30, but when he went out, it just stood at the tree line, staring into the dark. He said it was spooky quiet for a bit, like everything went dead. He thought maybe a bear was nearby. I didn't mention the stars, I just nodded. A few nights later, I went walking again, earlier this time around 9. Everything was normal, the sounds, the sky, all of it. But when I reached that same stretch of road, Rosie stopped and looked up, just like before. The air had that same weird weight to it. I felt my chest tighten. Nothing happened, though. No silence, no rearranged sky. It's been months now, but I still think about it. Sometimes when I'm outside late, I'll catch myself staring at the stars too long, like I'm waiting for them to move again. The strangest part is, a few nights after that first incident, I noticed my phone's GPS had started glitching. It kept putting my location a few miles north, near the Blue Ridge Parkway, even when I was home. It fixed itself after a day or two, but it was odd timing. Rosie still hesitates at that stretch of road. She's fine everywhere else, but when we reach that spot, she slows down, sometimes even stops completely. Her ears go up, she stares at the trees, and her tail lowers. I've tried walking her past it during the day, and she's fine then, but at night, never. I've driven that road a dozen times since. It looks completely normal, just gravel, trees, the creek running alongside. But whenever I pass it, I catch myself glancing up through the windshield, expecting the stars to be wrong again. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from nature calming down. It felt like something turned off the world for a few seconds, then switched it back on, like a power flicker, but for sound. And afterward, even though everything seemed normal again, nothing quite felt the same. I don't have a good explanation. Maybe there's one, maybe not. But I know what I heard, or didn't hear. I know what I saw when the stars came back. and I know that for a few seconds that night, the whole world felt paused, like we were caught in something we weren't supposed to notice. It was late, somewhere around 1 in the morning, when I was driving back from visiting my brother in Reno. The route I took was long and mostly empty, two-lane desert highway the whole way, cutting through stretches of scrub and rock with almost no lights for miles. I'd done the drive plenty of times before, and usually I kind of liked it. Just music, coffee, and silence. That night was colder than usual, the kind of dry cold that makes the inside of the windshield fog if you breathe too close to it. I had the heat on low, the radio turned down, and the road all to myself. The sky was clear enough that I could see the stars, way more than you ever get near the city. I remember thinking how bright they were. Then my clock blinked. It was the one built into the dash, digital, orange numbers. It jumped from 107 straight to 124. No flicker, no fade, just a single instant where it changed like someone had cut out a chunk of time. I stared at it for a few seconds before I looked down at my phone, which was plugged into the USB port. The phone read 1/3 and 24 too. I figured maybe it had synced automatically or something, but when I checked the radio display, same thing. Every clock in the car agreed. I hadn't zoned out. I hadn't dozed off. I was alert, both hands on the wheel, maybe halfway through my travel mug of coffee. The road ahead was the same straight line it had been the whole time. I slowed a little, just trying to get my bearings. That's when I glanced at the GPS. I'd been watching my mileage off and on since leaving Reno. The last time I checked, I was somewhere near mile marker 218. Now, the GPS said I was approaching 208, almost 10 miles farther than I remembered driving. I didn't recall passing any signs, any intersections, anything at all. Just a sudden skip forward. I thought maybe the GPS had glitched, lost signal, and reconnected, but the map looked fine. It was tracking normally, blue line solid. The car's odometer even reflected it, an extra 10 miles. I slowed down to about 40, trying to make sense of it. My mind went straight to simple explanations. Maybe I was just tired, maybe I'd missed something. But my coffee was still hot. The cup was still 3/4 full. I would have at least taken a sip in 17 minutes. The silence in the car started to feel heavy. I turned up the radio, but it was just static. Not like the usual kind when you lose a station. It was sharp and broken, with gaps between bursts. I hit seek, but it just cycled through frequencies without finding anything. When I looked back at the road, I noticed a light far ahead. Just a single white point. At first, I thought it was another car, but it wasn't moving toward me. It stayed perfectly still, low in the sky, but not quite touching the horizon. I figured it might be a plane or maybe a tower, except there were no towers out there. The light wasn't bright exactly, but it seemed sharper than it should have been, like it had edges. I kept driving, watching it. For the next few minutes, the light held steady. Then my headlights flickered once, just a brief pulse, and when they came back, the light was gone. I slowed again, glancing around. The desert on either side of the road was black, except for my beams catching the sand and low shrubs. I checked the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw a dim reflection of that same light behind me, way off, but when I blinked, it was gone too. My stomach was tight now. I pressed my foot on the gas a little harder, just to get through that stretch. About 5 minutes later, I noticed something else off. The dashboard screen, the one showing the trip info, was fluctuating. The estimated arrival time kept jumping back and forth by small increments. 2 to 17, 2:19, 2:16. Over and over. The GPS marker on the map would slide slightly ahead, then back, like it couldn't decide where I was. I switched to Apple Maps on my phone instead. It loaded fine, but placed my position a good quarter mile off the road, hovering in the middle of blank terrain. The blue dot stayed there, even as I kept driving. It didn't move with me. I looked up from the screen, and for the first time all night, I felt disoriented. The landscape outside looked subtly different. The low ridges on either side of the highway seemed taller, or maybe closer. The road surface looked slightly darker, the lane lines thicker and more freshly painted. Nothing extreme, just small, off details that didn't fit my memory of the drive. Then the radio snapped back to life on its own. A burst of music for maybe 2 seconds before cutting to static again. I don't even remember the song, just a flash of sound, almost like it was playing from underwater. I decided to pull over. There was a gravel shoulder, so I eased the car onto it and put it in park. The sky above was clear again. No light, no clouds. The silence out there was total. Even the engine ticking as it cooled sounded too loud. I checked my phone signal. 1 bar, enough for a call. I thought about phoning my brother, but it was almost 2 in the morning, and I didn't know what I'd say. So I just sat there for a bit, staring out into the dark. That's when I noticed something strange about the horizon. The stars weren't steady. They were shifting slightly, like there was heat distortion rising from the ground, but it was 40 degrees out. No reason for that kind of mirage. The distortion spread slowly upward in a band maybe 100 feet wide. I got out of the car. Probably a dumb decision, but I wanted to make sure I wasn't seeing things through the windshield. The cold air hit immediately, dry and biting. The distortion was still there, except now it had depth. Not color exactly, but density, like a piece of air that didn't belong to the rest. I took a few steps forward, gravel crunching under my boots, and the distortion shimmered once and vanished, just gone. I stood there waiting for something to happen, sound, wind, anything, but it stayed dead silent. When I got back in the car, the clock said 2:17. My phone said 2 flat. The two devices had been perfectly in sync before. I don't know how one could have jumped and not the other. The rest of the drive was quiet. The light never reappeared, the radio stayed dead, and the GPS eventually re-centered my location on the correct road. I didn't see another car until I was maybe 15 miles from home. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I checked the trip data again. The total mileage was about 10 miles higher than it should have been. I know that for sure because I'd written the odometer reading down earlier that day before leaving, trying to track fuel use. The time on my dash was still 17 minutes ahead of the one on my phone. The next morning, I went outside to check for any issues with the car, loose battery cables, electrical faults, anything that could explain a glitch. Everything looked fine. I tried resetting the clock manually, but later that night it jumped ahead again by exactly 17 minutes. Not 16, not 18. 17 on the dot. I synced it again, watched it for hours, and it held steady. It's never done it since. But every time I drive that same stretch of highway, right around mile marker 208, I catch myself checking the dash, waiting for the numbers to skip. It's like I'm half expecting to see the light again, hanging just above the horizon, still and sharp, like it's waiting for me to notice it. I'd been camping alone a few times before that trip, but always in busier areas, state parks, campgrounds with other people around. That weekend I wanted actual quiet. I drove out to a small lake in northern Idaho called Larkspur Lake. It's not totally unknown, but it's one of those places that doesn't show up much online, mostly just fishing forums and grainy satellite images. You have to take a long dirt road to get there, and there's no cell signal for miles. That's what appealed to me. I got there late afternoon. It was early September, warm during the day but cold at night. The water looked like glass, surrounded by tall pine and spruce, a few dead trees sticking out of the shallows. No one else around. I parked my old Subaru near the tree line and set up my tent maybe 20 yards from the water. The air felt heavy, like right before a storm, but the sky was clear. I cooked some canned chili on my little stove and watched the sun go down across the lake. The whole place turned this deep orange color, then slowly faded into gray. I sat by the fire for a while, listening to crickets and the occasional splash from a fish. There was a peace to it, but also this strange emptiness I can't explain. Like the sound didn't quite carry right. Around 10, I climbed into my sleeping bag and checked my phone. No service, of course. I remember looking at the time. 10:14 p.m. I turned it off to save battery, zipped the tent shut, and laid back. I could hear the wind picking up in the trees, just soft gusts. At some point during the night, I woke up to this low humming sound. At first, I thought it was my ears ringing, like when you stand up too fast. But it didn't fade. It deepened, steady and smooth, almost like the vibration of a distant engine. I could feel it through the ground and in my chest. It wasn't loud, exactly. It was just there, like background pressure. I checked my watch. 2:37 a.m. The sound didn't make sense. There weren't any roads close enough for cars, and planes never flew that low out there. I laid there for a minute, trying to tell if it was coming from outside or if it was something internal, like a weird sinus thing. But the tense fabric was trembling slightly, like it was reacting to bass from a speaker. I unzipped the sleeping bag halfway and listened harder. The hum didn't change pitch or volume. It stayed even, like a sustained note. I thought maybe it was the wind resonating through the valley somehow, but then I noticed the air inside the tent felt charged, static almost. Every hair on my arms was standing up. When I finally unzipped the tent door, I hesitated before looking out. The noise was definitely louder outside. I pushed my head through the opening, and that's when I saw it. The entire surface of the lake was glowing. Not bright, not like lights on the water, but a faint, milky white radiance spreading across every inch. It wasn't reflections. There was no moon, and my fire had long gone out. The glow was coming from the water itself. I crawled out completely and just stood there barefoot in the dirt. The humming got stronger, vibrating through my ribs. My first thought was some kind of chemical thing. Phosphorescent algae or gas bubbles or something natural. But the light was too even. It wasn't rippling or shifting. It was perfectly smooth, like a sheet of backlit glass. I took a step closer. The glow didn't brighten or dim. The lake looked frozen, even though I knew it wasn't. It was dead calm. No sound except that low vibration. I crouched down and tried to make sense of it, but I couldn't hear the usual night noises anymore. The crickets, the frogs, everything was silent. I turned to grab my flashlight, then realized I hadn't brought it out of the tent. When I turned back toward the lake, there was movement. A disturbance spreading from the far side, slow and deliberate, like something large had brushed the surface. The glow shimmered just a bit, then stilled again. I backed up a few steps. My breathing sounded too loud in the quiet. I told myself it was a fish, even though fish don't make wakes like that. The humming deepened. It wasn't mechanical. It almost felt alive, pulsing in rhythm. I could feel it shift slightly, like something tuning itself. It made me dizzy, like the inside of my ears were adjusting to pressure changes. Then, just for a moment, the glow dimmed in one area near the center of the lake. A soft, circular shadow formed, widening slowly. I couldn't tell if it was something above blocking the light or something below disrupting it. Either way, I didn't want to find out. I turned toward my car, intending to get inside and just wait it out, but my legs felt weirdly heavy, like walking through syrup. When I finally reached the tent, I ducked in, zipped it, and sat there shaking. The humming didn't stop. It just fluctuated slightly, like waves. The air was hot and thin. I pulled the sleeping bag around me and waited. After what felt like a long time, maybe 20 minutes, maybe more, I realized I couldn't feel the vibration anymore. The tent stopped trembling. The air cooled off. I listened for the hum, but it was gone, completely. I unzipped the flap just enough to peek out. The lake was dark again. No glow, no sound, just the usual night breeze and a faint ripple across the water. The crickets had started up again, their rhythm slow and normal. It felt like whatever had happened was over, just erased. I must have sat like that for another half hour before finally lying back down. I didn't sleep much, just drifted in and out until dawn. When the sun came up, the lake looked totally normal. Clear water, a few ripples from wind. No sign of anything strange. The ground around my tent had these tiny shallow impressions, though, like something heavy had rested there overnight. Not footprints, more like small circular dents, evenly spaced. I touched one, and the dirt felt compacted, almost fused. I packed up and left as soon as I could. The road back to town felt longer than usual. My phone picked up signal again about 20 minutes out, and I remember checking the time, 8:41 a.m., but my watch said 8:23. I don't know if it was off before or if it changed somehow. That was 2 summers ago. I haven't camped alone since. I tried looking up natural explanations, algae blooms, light refraction, stuff like that, but nothing really fits. I keep thinking about that low hum, the way it seemed to move through me more than around me. Sometimes I dream about that night, not the glowing lake itself, but the stillness afterward, the way everything went quiet, like the world paused for a second before remembering to keep going. It happened last October, a little after midnight. I live in Central Oregon, outside of Sisters, where the nights get cold and dry once fall sets in. My house sits at the edge of a patch of forest, mostly pine and juniper, with a small clearing behind it that I use for storing tools, firewood, and a couple of old metal lawn chairs. There aren't any streetlights out here, so when it gets dark, it's dark. That night, I was up later than usual, watching a movie in the living room. My phone buzzed around 12:38 a.m., a notification from my porch camera. It's one of those motion-activated models that pings your phone when something moves within a certain range. Normally it's raccoons or the neighbor's cat. When I opened the app, all I saw was a bright white glare filling the frame. It wasn't flickering like lightning, it was solid, steady light, almost too bright to look at on the screen. Then, after about 2 seconds, it cut to black again. The playback showed nothing else. No person, no car, no animal. Just a sudden wash of white like someone had aimed a floodlight at the house and shut it off. I went to the window, but everything outside looked normal. The yard light was off. The woods were just black shapes against the sky. It was quiet except for wind through the trees. I thought maybe it was a glitch, or that a car's headlights had somehow reflected off the camera, though the nearest road is over 100 yards away and mostly blocked by trees. I didn't go outside right then. I just checked the other camera feed from the backyard, and it showed nothing unusual. I figured I'd look at it in the morning when I wasn't half asleep. When I went out early the next day, probably around 7, the first thing I noticed was the smell. Not smoke exactly, but something faintly metallic, like hot iron or a tool that's been sitting in the sun too long. The air was cold, maybe in the 40s, but the smell made me pause. Then I noticed my old shovel leaning against the fence. When I touched the handle, it felt fine, cool like you'd expect, but the metal part of it was warm, not just a little noticeably warm like it had been sitting near a heater. That made me stop and check the other things around the yard. The nails in the fence posts were warm too. The latch on the gate, same thing. The old wheelbarrow, the chain on the shed door, the metal spigot by the side of the house, all of it was warm. Not hot enough to burn, but definitely out of place for how cold the morning air was. I thought maybe a neighbor had done a burn pile or something that radiated heat, but there wasn't any sign of that. The ground wasn't scorched, the trees looked fine, no smoke. Everything looked untouched. I went back inside and replayed the porch camera clip again on my laptop, slowing it down frame by frame. The light didn't come from one side, it just appeared everywhere in the frame at once, pure white. No direction or shadow. For the 2 seconds it lasted, I could barely make out the outline of the trees and part of the driveway before everything went blank. I downloaded the clip and sent it to my friend Caleb, who knows more about tech stuff than I do. He said it didn't look like a lens flare or IR reflection. He pointed out something weird I hadn't noticed. The timestamp skipped forward by almost a full second right after the flash. Normally the camera records continuously, but this one jumped from 12:38.7 to 12:38.9 with no missing footage flag. It's like it lost a fraction of time during the flash itself. I didn't really know what to do with that information. It just didn't make sense. Around noon, I checked again, and by then the metal objects had cooled off. Everything felt normal. But later that afternoon, I found something odd out in the clearing. About 10 feet behind the shed, the pine needles on the ground were discolored, like a pale gray ring about 5 feet across. The dirt underneath wasn't burned, but it looked disturbed, like the top layer had been brushed aside. I crouched down and ran my hand over it. It was smooth, almost polished in the middle, like something heavy had pressed down evenly across it. But there were no footprints, no tire tracks, nothing leading in or out. That night, I decided to leave the cameras running again, just to see if anything else happened. Around the same time, 12:40 or so, the back camera recorded something faint. It wasn't another flash, more like a dim glow, almost circular, moving across the trees behind the fence. The light wasn't bright enough to illuminate the ground, but it had a kind of shimmer to it, like heat distortion. It moved slowly, maybe 10 or 15 feet, then faded out. When I went out the next morning, the air had that same faint metallic smell again. No warmth this time, though. The ring behind the shed looked the same, maybe a little wider. I couldn't tell if that was just my imagination. Over the next few days, nothing else happened. The cameras didn't catch any more flashes, and the smell faded after a while. But I started noticing small things around the yard that didn't feel right. My bird feeder's metal hook was slightly bent, like it had been pulled downward. A couple of screws from the fence were missing, but the boards hadn't come loose. Caleb came by one weekend to check it out for himself. He brought a cheap EMF meter, mostly for fun. We didn't find much, except when he held it over that pale ring in the clearing, it spiked once, then went back to normal. He couldn't explain that either. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I looked outside, I thought I saw a faint light moving between the trees. Not bright, just a shimmer like reflections off glass. The motion sensor didn't trigger though, so I told myself it was my eyes adjusting to the dark. A few mornings later, I found that one of the metal chairs out back had been dragged a few feet from where it usually sat. The legs left marks in the dirt. At first I thought maybe wind had moved it, but the chair's heavy steel, no way it could have shifted like that on its own. I tried to brush it all off, but one night about a week after the first flash, the porch camera went off again. This time just a quick pulse of light, half a second at most. When I checked the clip, the light seemed to come from above, like a spotlight through the fog, except there wasn't any fog that night. The weirdest part was that for the few frames it appeared, the trees and fence posts cast no shadows. Everything was lit evenly, like the source was everywhere at once. After that, I unplugged the cameras for a while. It wasn't that I didn't want to know what was happening, I just couldn't handle seeing it again. A couple of weeks later, we got a hard frost. When I went out to refill the wood rack, I noticed that the gray ring behind the shed was still bare. No frost at all, while everything else had a light dusting. The soil there was dry and a few degrees warmer to the touch. I stood there for a while, just feeling the ground with my hand, trying to think of any normal reason for it. Eventually, I covered it with some boards. I don't know why. Maybe just so I didn't have to look at it anymore. Now, months later, the boards have warped a bit from the rain. The ground underneath still doesn't grow anything, not even moss. And every once in a while, if I'm outside late at night, I swear the air has that same faint metallic smell again, just for a few seconds before the wind shifts. I keep the cameras off now. The yard feels better that way, quiet, uneventful. But sometimes I catch myself glancing at the fence, wondering if the nails are still warm. I was driving back from my cousin's place in western Iowa late last August. It was around midnight, maybe a little past, and I was taking back roads to avoid construction on the main highway. The sky was clear, the kind of rural darkness where you can actually see the Milky Way. I had the windows cracked, the air thick with that sweet cornfield smell. The road I was on was one of those narrow, two-lane stretches where you can drive 20 minutes without seeing another car. No houses, no lights, just endless fields on both sides. My gas tank was fine, my phone had signal, everything was normal. About 15 minutes outside of Red Oak, I saw something strange ahead, out over the corn. At first, I thought it was a plane, just a bright white light low on the horizon. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't moving like one. It wasn't blinking or drifting. It was perfectly still, hovering maybe 100 feet above the field. I slowed down, trying to make sense of it. The light didn't look like any aircraft I'd seen. It wasn't harsh or glowing outward, more like a soft white sphere, the brightness concentrated in the center. No beam, no halo, just this quiet orb hanging over the crops. I pulled over. There was a small gravel shoulder beside the road, and I eased my car onto it, hazards off. I killed the engine and got out. The only sound was crickets and the faint hiss of wind through the corn. The light was maybe half a mile out. Too close to be a star, too still to be a drone. I remember feeling weirdly calm about it at first, like it was something worth documenting instead of being afraid of. I took out my phone, opened the camera, and zoomed in. Right away, the image looked off. The phone tried to autofocus, but the light kept fuzzing out, like it couldn't decide if it was near or far. I snapped a few pictures anyway. I even recorded a short video, though on the screen it looked like nothing but static. Then as I stood there, I noticed the sound. The crickets had stopped, just like that. Total silence. I hadn't even noticed it fade. 1 second there was this blanket of insect noise, the next it was gone. Even the wind died down. I turned a slow circle, trying to hear anything. My own breathing sounded too loud. The stillness made my skin prickle. When I looked back at the light, it seemed closer. It hadn't moved dramatically, maybe a few hundred feet, but it was definitely larger now, maybe the size of a small car. I couldn't tell if it was drifting toward me or just descending lower over the field. The way it sat there didn't look right, though. There was no sway, no bob, no flicker, just perfect motionless balance. I started recording again, zoomed all the way in. The camera adjusted brightness automatically, and for a split second, I thought I saw shapes around the light, faint outlines like smoke or haze twisting around it. Then it all went black. The phone screen froze. I tapped it, nothing. The whole thing shut off. I tried the power button, no response. I glanced around, uneasy now. The silence felt heavy, almost physical, pressing in from all sides. Then the air shifted. It was like the moment before a thunderstorm, that subtle charge you can feel in your chest. My hair stood up on my arms. The air smelled different too, metallic, like ozone or hot wires. And then the light brightened suddenly, just for an instant, almost too white to look at, and everything went dark. Not nighttime dark, pitch black. The cornfield, the sky, even the faint glow from my car's headlights, gone. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. There was a strange ringing in my ears, not loud, just persistent. I remember blinking hard, thinking maybe my eyes had adjusted weird, but nothing changed. I was floating in total blackness. And then, just as suddenly as it had gone, the world snapped back. The engine of my car was running. I hadn't started it. The dashboard lights were on. My phone buzzed in my pocket, powered on again. At first I thought only a few seconds had passed, but when I got in and checked the clock, it read 2:43 a.m. That didn't make sense. It had been 11:40 something when I'd stopped. I checked my phone next. Same time. 2:43. 3 hours. Just gone. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, trying to steady my breathing. The road was exactly as before, the same stretch of cornfield, the same empty sky, except the light was gone. No glow, no haze, nothing. Just stars. I turned the car around and started driving back the way I came, slowly at first, then faster. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see that white light behind me, but the fields were dark and empty. About 10 minutes later, my radio cut out mid-song. Total static. I reached to turn it off, and before I could, the static stopped, replaced by this faint, rhythmic clicking sound. Slow, even, almost like a pulse. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then silence. The radio never picked up a signal again until I hit the next town. When I got to a gas station in Red Oak, I parked under the bright canopy lights and checked my phone again. The photos I'd taken were all there, or at least the files were. But every single one was completely black. Even the metadata was strange. Each image had a timestamp of 2:43 a.m., not the times I'd actually taken them, but all identical, down to the second. The video I'd recorded was also black, but it was 17 minutes long. I had no memory of filming anything for that long. I remember standing in that gas station parking lot, the buzz of the fluorescent lights above me, just staring at my phone like it was lying to me. I felt disoriented, like I'd woken up from a long nap and couldn't piece together where I was. When I touched the hood of my car, it was warm. Not the normal warmth from an engine, but evenly warm. The roof, the doors, the trunk. It had been a cool night, barely 60 degrees. The metal shouldn't have felt like that. I ended up staying at a cheap motel outside of town because I didn't want to drive anymore. I couldn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd see that white light, hovering perfectly still over the corn. In the morning, I walked around the car, just checking for anything. Scratches, residue, dents, nothing. I opened the trunk, and the smell hit me right away. That same metallic ozone smell from the field. It was faint but unmistakable. The trunk was empty, except for my backpack. The smell seemed strongest near the back panel, like it was seeping from the metal itself. I drove home later that morning, mostly in silence. I tried calling my cousin to ask if I'd called him that night, maybe to check the time, something, but he said he hadn't heard from me after I left around 10. When I plugged my phone into my laptop later, the system clock changed on its own, jumped forward exactly 3 hours. Then it froze. I unplugged it right away. It's been months, and I've never had another moment like that. But every once in a while, if I drive past a cornfield at night, I'll notice my phone screen dim for a second, like it's trying to adjust to something that isn't there. The weirdest part? The car's dashboard clock never corrected itself. No matter how many times I reset it, it drifts forward slowly, always catching up, little by little, until it's 3 hours ahead again. Every time I notice it, I think about that light, how quiet the world went, and how sure I was that it was watching me long before I pulled over. I was driving back from Tucson after visiting my sister. It was close to midnight, one of those dry, empty desert nights where the air feels almost static. I took the long way home, cutting through the back highways near Idaho to avoid traffic. That stretch is just 2 lanes and a whole lot of nothing. No gas stations for miles, barely any service, and once you pass the turnoff to the mines, the only light you see is your own. The road was quiet. I had the windows cracked and the radio low, just static and faint music from some AM station. My car, an old gray Tacoma, rattled a little on the rough asphalt. I'd been driving maybe an hour since the last town when I noticed a set of lights low on the horizon. At first, I thought it was a plane. Out there you see all kinds, military, cargo, sometimes drones. So I didn't think much of it. But these lights weren't blinking, and they were too low for a plane. There were 5 of them, lined up in a shallow curve, white with a slight orange tint. They looked far away, hanging just above the desert floor. I watched them off and on for a few minutes, waiting for them to move, but they didn't. They just hung there, steady and silent. I even turned off the radio to listen, thinking maybe it was a convoy or something with engines I couldn't hear yet. Nothing. The weird part started when the road curved right around a big, dry wash. The lights shifted with me, not like they were moving independently, more like they were mirroring the angle of the turn, keeping the same distance and formation. I remember glancing at my rear view, thinking maybe I was seeing a reflection from something behind me, but the desert was empty. No headlights, no glow on the horizon, just blackness. I slowed down a little, maybe to 45, and the lights seemed to slow too. The formation held the same position relative to me, about 1 o'clock from where I sat, half a mile or so out. It was eerie how perfect the movement was. When I sped up again, they matched. When I braked, they did too. Not exactly at the same time, but close enough that I noticed it. I pulled over onto the shoulder after a few miles. My first thought was maybe it was some kind of optical illusion. Maybe I was seeing reflections from something I didn't understand. I stepped out, leaving my headlights on, and the sound of the engine faded into the still desert air. It was cold, colder than I expected for that time of year, and the wind had that dry, dusty smell that clings to your clothes. The lights just hung there. No sound, no movement. I tried taking a video with my phone, but the screen stayed black. It didn't even pick up my headlights. I adjusted the brightness, switched to photo mode. Nothing. The screen lagged, froze, and then the app closed. When I reopened it, the clock in the corner said 12:42 a.m. I looked at the truck's dash clock when I got back in. It said 11:58. I sat there for a few seconds, trying to process that, then turned the truck around. I figured if it was something strange, I'd rather head toward the last town than keep going deeper into nothing. The lights mirrored that too. When I turned around, they shifted across the sky like a reflection on glass. Same spacing, same distance, now hovering on the opposite side of me. I started driving again, faster this time, trying not to look at them too much. They stayed right where they were. Every time the road bent, they bent. Every time I hit a hill or a dip, they adjusted like they were tethered to me. After about 10 minutes, I passed an old rest stop that hadn't been open in years. It's just a cracked concrete pad, a couple of broken picnic tables, and a rusted-out bathroom with no doors. I pulled in there and cut the engine. The lights stopped too. They didn't fade or drift. They just froze, exactly in line with me. For a long minute, I sat in the truck with the engine off, staring. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I thought about honking the horn, but something about that felt wrong. Like I didn't want to draw attention to myself, even though there was no one else out there. I rolled down the window instead and just listened. The desert is never truly silent, but that night it was close. No insects, no wind, not even the ticking sound of the engine cooling. Just stillness. Then, for maybe 5 seconds, I saw movement between the lights. Faint, like something dark and solid passed through them. It blocked the stars behind for just an instant before disappearing again. That was when I noticed the headlights of my truck flickered, dimmed, then slowly faded out. I tried to start the engine, but it wouldn't even click. The dash lights went dead too. I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, staring at those lights. They seemed closer now. Not by much, maybe 100 feet closer, but definitely closer. Then they began to drift apart, widening the formation, the edges pulling away like the curve was opening. I don't know why, but it felt like they were looking for something. After a few seconds, the center light brightened. Not dramatically, just enough to cast a faint glow across the ground. I could see the outlines of the picnic tables, the glint of metal from a rusted sign, even the shadow of my own truck stretching out toward the desert. And then everything snapped back. The lights dimmed to nothing. My headlights blinked on again, and the radio came to life mid-song. The dash clock read 2:14 a.m. I didn't think. I threw the truck into gear and floored it. The tires kicked up gravel and dust, and for a while I didn't even look back. When I finally did, the lights were gone. The horizon was empty. I drove until I hit Gila Bend, where I stopped at a gas station just off the highway. There was a guy in the parking lot refueling a semi. I must have looked weird because he asked if I was okay. I told him my truck had been acting up. When I went to pay for gas, I noticed my phone had turned off completely. The battery, which had been around 80% before, was now at 5%. The time on it said 4:36 a.m. By the time I got home, the sky was starting to lighten. I plugged my phone in and tried again to open the camera roll. There was nothing. No photos, no videos from that night at all. The most recent one was from earlier that day at my sister's house. Out of curiosity, I checked the truck later that morning. The hood and doors were warm to the touch, even though it had been sitting in the shade for hours. That stretch of road, the one between Ajo and Gila Bend, I've taken dozens of times before. It's flat, predictable, nothing remarkable about it. But now, every time I drive it, I catch myself glancing toward that same spot off the highway. Sometimes I think I see faint lights again, far off where the desert meets the sky. Not moving, just waiting. I was hiking alone when I found it. Late September up in the San Juan Mountains, Colorado side. The weather was perfect. Blue sky, around 60 degrees, the kind of dry cool that makes you feel like you could walk forever. I'd camped the night before near a small stream off Forest Road 622, probably 10 miles south of Silverton. I was planning to spend 2 nights out there before heading back to work on Monday. The first part of the day was normal. I'd left my tent pitched and taken just a day pack, some snacks, my camera, a small first aid kit. The trail was barely marked, more like a game path cutting through scrub and pine. I hadn't seen a single other person since the morning before. Around noon, I stopped for lunch on a flat stretch near a ridge. From there, you could see a long valley below, full of gold aspens and dark spruce. The air smelled like resin and dust. I remember thinking it was one of those rare, quiet moments you don't get in normal life. No engines, no voices, just wind and birds. Then, sometime after 1 o'clock, I noticed something that didn't fit. I was heading downslope toward a shaded area when I caught this faint shimmer ahead, like heat off pavement. Except it was cold out, and I was in shadow. I stopped and took a few steps sideways, thinking it was sunlight hitting quartz or something, but the shimmer stayed put. When I got closer, I realized it was light reflecting off a charred surface, the trunk of a tree. At first glance, it looked like it had been hit by lightning, but not in any way I'd seen before. The burn pattern wasn't random. It was a perfect spiral, starting near the roots and winding up the trunk clockwise, tight and even, all the way to the top where it stopped abruptly, like it had been measured. The bark was blackened smooth, almost glossy. What got me, though, was everything around it. The grass at the base was green, untouched. The ferns beside it were still damp from dew. Even the fallen needles around the roots weren't scorched. There was no smell of smoke, no signs of heat. It looked like someone had peeled the spiral onto the trunk with a blowtorch, but left everything else pristine. I crouched down and ran my hand near the bark, not touching, just close enough to feel. There was a faint warmth radiating off it, like the heat you'd get from a sunlit rock hours after sunset. But the area was shaded. The tree shouldn't have been warm at all. I took out my phone to snap a picture, but the camera app froze. Just a black screen. I tried again, same thing. The battery was at 70%, but it acted like it was dying. I figured maybe the cold had messed with it, so I pocketed it and took out my old Canon. That one worked fine, but every photo I took looked wrong on the preview. Slightly out of focus, even though I wasn't moving. I stood there maybe 5 minutes, circling the tree, trying to make sense of it. The spiral was almost mesmerizing. Each band end was about 2 inches wide, wrapping evenly all the way up. The inside of the spiral was darker than the outer edge, fading like it had been burned from within. Then I noticed something else. The forest around me had gone completely silent. No birds, no wind. Even the usual creak of trees shifting was gone, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I stepped back and looked around. The stillness was so heavy it felt physical. I realized I hadn't even heard my own footsteps for a few seconds. I stomped lightly on the ground. No sound. I snapped my fingers. Nothing. It was like someone had turned off the world. I remember this hollow feeling in my chest. Not quite panic, but close. I backed up another few feet and then, just as suddenly, sound returned. Faint at first, then all at once. Wind through the branches, a bird call far off, the rustle of leaves. I stood there frozen, trying to decide if I'd just had some kind of auditory hallucination. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it was echoing in my head. When I finally looked back at the tree, something about it had changed. I couldn't tell what at first. Then I realized the spiral looked shallower. The contrast wasn't as sharp. It almost seemed like the blackened bark was fading. That scared me more than anything. I started walking back toward camp, not running, but fast. I glanced over my shoulder a few times, and every time I did, I could still see that faint shimmer in the corner of my vision, like heat haze, even though I was well out of the clearing. When I got back to my tent, it was later than I expected. The sun was already low, throwing orange light through the trees. I checked my watch. 6:40 p.m. I'd left around noon. It should have been maybe a 2-hour hike out and back, tops. Somehow, I'd lost nearly 5 hours. My phone was still dead when I pulled it out, wouldn't turn on. My camera worked, but when I scrolled through the photos, the ones from the tree were gone. Every shot I'd taken after noon just wasn't there, like the memory card had been wiped clean from that point on. I built a fire as it got dark, mostly for comfort. I didn't eat much, just sat by the flames listening to the forest. I didn't hear anything unusual, but I couldn't shake this feeling that something was watching from just beyond the light. I told myself it was just nerves, that I was tired. Around 10, I crawled into my tent. I was half asleep when I heard a single thump outside, like a heavy branch dropping onto soft dirt. I froze. Lucy, my dog, wasn't with me that trip, so it wasn't her. The sound came again, but lighter, almost like a footstep. I unzipped the tent a couple inches and peeked out. The fire had mostly died down, just glowing coals now. Nothing moved. I sat there staring for a full minute, then zipped it back up. The next morning, everything looked normal. My phone powered on like nothing had happened, battery at 68%. My watch, though, was 2 hours ahead of the correct time. I know because I checked it against the car clock later. On my way out, I made myself go back to where the tree had been. I wanted proof I hadn't dreamed it. When I got there, the clearing looked exactly the same, except the trunk was gone. Not cut, not fallen, gone. There was a smooth patch of dirt where it should have stood, as if it had been uprooted perfectly clean. No debris, no stump, not even disturbed soil around the base. Just a faint ring of black dust, spiraling outward like smoke residue. I stood there staring at that spot for a long time, trying to think of anything rational. Maybe I'd taken a wrong turn, but I recognized the ridgeline, the same fallen log nearby. It was the same place. When I finally turned to leave, I noticed something odd at the edge of the clearing. A thin streak of black running along the ground, twisting in the same spiral pattern as the tree. It led maybe 30 feet before disappearing under moss. I followed it for a while, but it faded until I couldn't see it anymore. The hike back to my car felt longer than it should have. The woods seemed brighter, but in that washed out way you get before a storm. By the time I reached the road, clouds were rolling in fast, low, and gray. I didn't look back again. That was 2 years ago. I've gone hiking plenty since, but not in that area. I tried once last summer, but as soon as I got near the turnoff for that forest road, my GPS started glitching, freezing, then skipping ahead a half mile. I took that as a sign and kept driving. I still have the camera I brought that day. The memory card works fine, but whenever I try to recover the deleted files, the software crashes. Always at the same timestamp, 1:13 p.m. That's about when I first saw the spiral. Sometimes I wonder if anyone else has ever found something like that. A tree burned perfect and alone, untouched by everything around it. But I've never heard of another case, and I've looked. Whatever it was, it didn't leave much behind. Just that ring of black dust, and the feeling even now that I walked into something I wasn't supposed to see. I got the call around 9 the next morning. I was sitting in the parking lot outside work, drinking the end of a coffee that had gone cold, when my coworker, Megan, called. Her voice was weirdly casual, like she was trying not to sound too interested. She said, "Hey, did you see those lights over your house last night?" I said no, kind of laughing, because I thought she was joking. I live out in the west part of town, near the edge where it starts to turn into farmland. No streetlights, no traffic noise, nothing but fields and a couple of older houses. She told me she and her boyfriend had been driving home around midnight, and when they passed the road my neighborhood's on, they saw what looked like a bunch of orange-white lights hovering over the tree line. Like 5 or 6 of them, she said, perfectly spaced apart, not blinking. I told her she must have seen a plane, or maybe one of those light formations people make with drones, but she swore it wasn't that. They weren't moving, she said, not even a little. Then they all just faded out. I brushed it off, but what stuck with me was that she knew exactly where I lived. She described the turnoff by the old mailbox with the dented side. There's no mistaking it. She'd definitely seen something over that area. When I got home that evening, I checked my phone. It had been plugged in all night, but the battery was dead, like 0%. I thought maybe I hadn't seated the charger right, but when I picked the cable up, it felt warm, like it had been plugged in and drawing power. I plugged it back in, waited a minute, and it charged normally. That was the first thing that felt off. The second came when I checked my porch camera later that night. I only have one angled toward the driveway. Around 12:07 a.m., the feed cut out. The motion log showed it recording right up until that time, then nothing for about 40 minutes. No error, no alert. It just skipped. When it came back online, the street looked darker than usual, like the exposure was struggling to adjust. There were no cars, no people, no weather issues, just a quiet, empty street. I told myself it was a connection glitch. But that night, while I was sitting on the couch watching TV, I noticed this faint humming sound. It wasn't loud, just steady, like a low electrical buzz. It reminded me of the sound old power transformers make. I muted the TV, thinking maybe it was coming from the fridge or the AC unit. But when I walked into the kitchen, it got quieter. Then, near the window by the sink, I realized the hum wasn't coming from inside the house. It was outside, faint but definitely there, like it was hanging in the air somewhere beyond the fence. It lasted maybe a minute. I stepped onto the back porch and stood there trying to locate it. The sky was clear, no wind, no bugs, just still air and the faintest vibration of sound that I could feel more than hear. And then, just like that, it stopped. The night went back to being completely quiet. I probably wouldn't have thought about it again if the same thing didn't happen the next night. Around 11:30, that same faint humming started again. This time I went straight outside with my phone, thinking maybe I could record it, but my phone glitched. The camera froze as soon as I opened it. The screen went black for a few seconds before it restarted. By the time it came back on, the sound was gone. I texted Megan and asked her what exactly she'd seen that night. She replied about 10 minutes later, "We thought you were out there. The lights were right over your house. Looked like you had spotlights on or something." That threw me. My house doesn't have any outdoor lighting besides the porch lamp. I asked if she took a picture. but she said she tried and her camera wouldn't focus. All the lights came out as smears. That weekend, I decided to check the backyard during the day. I don't know what I was expecting, but I walked around looking for burn marks or tire tracks or anything unusual. There wasn't much, except for a faint, circular patch in the grass that was flattened more than the rest, about 8 feet across. You wouldn't notice it unless you were looking. The weird thing was, the blades weren't dead or burned, just bent. The pattern was too clean to be wind. That night, I brought my lawn chair out and sat by the back fence with a flashlight and a beer, waiting to see if anything weird would happen. For the first hour, nothing did. Then, around midnight, that same humming started up again, but higher this time, like it was directly above me. The sound wasn't coming from any direction I could pinpoint. It just filled the space. The trees at the back of the yard started to shimmer slightly, like there was heat distortion around them. I killed the flashlight and looked up. The stars were visible, but something was blocking a few of them. A faint outline, darker than the sky, not moving. I only noticed it because of how still everything was. The crickets had stopped. The air felt heavy. Then, out of nowhere, a sharp flash of light came from behind the tree line. Not bright enough to blind me, just sudden and white, like a camera flash from a distance. I flinched and instinctively checked my phone to see if it captured anything, but the screen was blank. Completely black, even though it was still on. After maybe 10 seconds, the screen came back and the clock showed 41 a.m. I looked around, confused, because I could have sworn the hum had just started a few minutes ago. But when I checked the beer can, condensation had dried and it was warm to the touch. I went inside. My heart was pounding, and the whole house felt off, like the air pressure had changed. I remember the lights in the kitchen flickering when I turned them on. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I started to drift off, I thought I heard that faint hum again, but it was hard to tell if it was real or in my head. The next morning, I noticed something strange in the grass again. The circular patch was still there, but the blades that had been bent before were now standing straight, and the ground underneath felt slightly warm, like sun-warmed concrete. It had been cloudy all morning. I texted my neighbor, Tom, to see if he'd heard anything weird the past few nights. He said no, but he mentioned his dog had been acting strange, pacing near the back fence, whining at the sky. A couple of days later, I checked the porch camera again. That same gap in footage appeared, but at a different time, 11:59 p.m. to 12:40 a.m. When the video resumed, the timestamp glitched for a second and jumped forward exactly 2 minutes. The last thing I did was try to take a picture of the yard where the circle had been, but when I opened my photo gallery afterward, the picture wasn't there. The newest photo on my phone was from 2 days earlier. I didn't tell anyone else at work about it. Megan asked a week later if things had stopped being weird, but I didn't know how to answer that. The following Sunday, my power went out around midnight. No storm, no warning, just a full blackout. When it came back about half an hour later, the microwave clock was flashing 2:43 a.m. The next morning, my phone battery was at 1%, even though it had been fully charged before bed. I plugged it in and noticed the metal part of the charging cable was faintly warm again. I haven't heard the hum since then, but sometimes, when I'm outside late at night, I look up and realize the sky over my house feels emptier than it used to, like something's missing. I was driving home late, past midnight, on the stretch of highway that cuts through the Badlands outside of Rapid City. It's the kind of road where you don't see another car for 30-40 miles, and most nights it's just you, the occasional coyote, and the wind rattling the guardrails. That night it was overcast and gusty, the kind of wind that made the little rocks along the shoulder roll like tiny marbles. I had the heat on low, my truck humming along at 65, and my thoughts mostly on the fact that I'd left my phone charger at the office again. I don't know exactly when I first noticed it, but out of the corner of my eye, something was reflecting my headlights. At first, I assumed it was a piece of trash on the side of the road, maybe a soda can or some foil. But it moved, slowly, against the wind, like it had weight, but was somehow gliding. I blinked and focused, and the shimmer, silver, metallic, thin like aluminum foil stretched too tight, was drifting in the air about 10 feet off the ground, maybe 100 feet ahead. I slowed, keeping my eyes on it. I even flicked my high beams on and off, thinking maybe the reflection was messing with me. It didn't react like a deer or a bird would. It stayed there, moving sideways against the gusts, perfectly smooth, like it had its own intention. I felt my stomach tighten the way it does when something is off, but you can't explain why. I pulled over to the shoulder, the tires crunching on the gravel, and cut the engine. For a moment, the only sound was the wind. I looked out toward the shimmer, but it was gone. Just empty road, the asphalt slick with the night's dew. I grabbed my phone to get a flashlight beam out, and that's when I noticed something. I stepped out of the truck and looked at my tires. The asphalt was smooth, black, wet, and my tires didn't leave a mark. Not a single groove, not even the faintest streak from the dew. I bent down, ran a finger across the treads, perfectly clean. I shook my head and muttered to myself, thinking maybe the wind had been playing tricks with the light, but I swore I'd seen it. Something metallic, moving with purpose, ignoring the wind like it had its own force. I glanced down the highway, scanning the dark horizon. There was nothing. No deer, no fence post, no glint of a reflective surface. I got back in the truck and turned the engine over. My heartbeat was quick, that shallow kind you get when you can't tell your brain if it's panicking for a real reason or not. I started driving slowly, eyes on the horizon. Then I saw it again, just at the edge of my headlights, maybe 50 feet ahead. The shimmer was closer this time, moving sideways, a silver thread suspended in the air, glinting in erratic angles that didn't make sense. I tried to follow it, but it drifted along the edge of the road, and no matter how I turned, it seemed to anticipate me, staying in view but never getting any closer. I tapped the horn, figured maybe I'd spook it. Nothing. The shimmer didn't react. It didn't move faster. It didn't scatter. Just hovered in that same slow, unnatural glide. I thought about turning around, but the road is a long, narrow strip, and the wind was picking up. It was cold now, biting through my jacket. I stopped again, engine off, and watched. That's when I heard it, a faint metallic whisper like aluminum brushing over metal, but not wind. It didn't come from the road or the trees, just from the shimmer. I leaned out the window, trying to see more clearly. The wind tossed my hair, rattled the mirrors, but the shimmer stayed smooth, almost floating above us. Then, out of nowhere, it vanished. 1 second, it was there, the next, gone. I squinted, adjusted my eyes to the darkness. Nothing. I got out to check, careful not to move too fast. Gravel crunched under my boots, the wind carried my breath in white streaks. I looked around. Nothing. Not a scrap, not a reflection, not even a disturbed leaf. I got back in the truck again, uneasy. I didn't know what to make of it. Metallic? Floating? Gliding against the wind? None of it made sense. I tried calling my buddy Mark, but no signal. I drove on cautiously, staring at the road and shoulders, expecting maybe some trick of the headlights to reveal it again. About 10 miles down the highway, I saw another flicker of light at the tree line, on the opposite side of the road. This time, it was more like a ripple in the air than a shimmer. I slowed, but it didn't move toward me. It didn't move at all. I held the truck still, watching, and the longer I stared, the more I felt it. That low, almost imperceptible pressure in my chest, like the air itself was vibrating slightly. Then I realized something. I couldn't see the moon, couldn't see stars. The clouds were thick and moving fast, pushed by the same wind that the shimmer had defied. But the ripple of light didn't have shadows, didn't reflect. It was just there, vibrating slightly, like a heat haze, except cold. I blinked, looked again, and it vanished entirely. Not drifted, not sank behind trees, nothing. The tree line was black, normal, like I'd imagined it into existence. My eyes watered from the wind, and I felt a shiver I couldn't shake. I drove the rest of the way slowly, watching for anything, but there was nothing. No shimmer, no ripple, no light, no sound. I finally reached the town limits, streetlights cutting through the darkness. My tires, when I rolled over the asphalt again, left tracks, normal tracks. I got home, left the truck running in the driveway for a minute to calm down. Benny, my dog, jumped into the cab and gave me that look, the one that always makes me feel like he can read my mind. I didn't try to explain it to him. I went inside, locked the doors, and kept the lights on. For the next few days, I checked the stretch of highway on my drive home. Nothing. Normal wind, normal asphalt, normal night sky, but I know what I saw. That metallic shimmer, defying the wind, moving like it had purpose. And the asphalt perfectly untouched by my tires, as if reality had paused just for a second around it. I still think about it sometimes when I drive out there at night. I'm cautious, scanning the shoulders, the tree line, every reflection of my headlights. And every once in a while, when the wind gusts just right and the asphalt is wet, I swear I can see it again. A glint against the darkness, moving sideways, waiting. I'd been out near Pine Ridge late that night, the kind of night where the sky is just endless black and the stars feel close enough to touch. I go out there sometimes to shoot long exposures for astrophotography. I like the solitude, the quiet, the way the world shrinks down to constellations and the hum of your own thoughts. I had my tripod set up about a mile off the highway on a gravel access road, my truck parked behind a small rise so it wouldn't ruin the shot with headlights. It was a cold night, the kind that bites through layers. I had my jacket zipped up, gloves on, and a thermos of coffee that had gone lukewarm an hour ago. I framed the shot on my DSLR, set it for a 20-second exposure, and hit the shutter. Then I leaned back on the tripod case and just watched the sky, the usual stars twinkling, nothing out of place. I did 3 more exposures like that, each one just slightly different, trying to capture the Milky Way crossing above the horizon. By the 4th, I noticed something that didn't quite fit. There was a flicker of movement, or maybe light, at the edge of my peripheral vision, like a faint glow that wasn't from a star or an aircraft. It was subtle, only there for a second, then gone. I shrugged. My eyes are probably tired. It happens. The 5th exposure, I left the shutter open for a minute and a half. I leaned on the tripod, sipping the cold coffee, staring at the sky. That's when I noticed it again. There was a faint, almost imperceptible pattern of lights forming in the sky, but I couldn't see it clearly with my eyes. It wasn't like a plane or a satellite, nothing moving in a straight line. More like a grid, faint points of brightness arranged in lines and angles that didn't belong to any constellation I knew. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and thought maybe it was fatigue, but it persisted. I moved slightly to check from a different angle, and nothing changed. I couldn't see the pattern with my naked eye, only a sense that something was there. I decided to finish the long exposure. The camera's red recording light blinked steadily. When it finished, I looked at the image on the back of the LCD. My stomach twisted when I saw it. There it was, clearly etched into the sky. A series of geometric shapes, triangles and hexagons, perfectly aligned, glowing faintly white. They weren't stars, not satellites, not airplanes. The shapes were too precise, too angular, too deliberate. I stared at the screen, comparing it to the sky above me. Nothing. The sky looked normal. No patterns. Just endless stars. I took another shot, same location, same exposure time, holding my breath. The pattern appeared again, identical in geometry but slightly rotated. It didn't correspond to any known constellation or star map. I started taking more shots, moving the tripod slightly each time, trying to see if it was an optical illusion or a reflection on my lens. But every image revealed the same strange geometric shapes, perfectly rendered, glowing faintly in the same way. I packed up my gear slowly, trying not to panic. My hands were shaking, though I told myself it was just cold. I drove back toward the highway, glancing at the sky through the windshield. Nothing. The stars were normal, scattered randomly like always. The pattern existed only in the long exposures. By the time I got back to my apartment, I was too unsettled to review the images further. I left them on the memory card and went inside, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could almost see the pattern, hovering faintly above the horizon, impossible angles and lines etched across the sky. The next morning, I looked at the shots again, in full resolution on my computer. The shapes were unmistakable. Some triangles formed perfect equilateral figures, hexagons aligned with impossible precision, all interconnected in a lattice that seemed almost architectural. Each exposure captured a slightly different arrangement, as if the pattern was slowly rotating or shifting. I compared them side by side. Nothing in the stars themselves had moved, nothing in the background. Yet the shapes persisted, I checked online forums for any mention of similar phenomena. There were discussions about long exposure lens artifacts, satellites, even rare atmospheric refractions. I tried replicating it in my backyard with a shorter exposure and cheap equipment. Nothing, only the normal stars, random and scattered. Over the next week, I went back to the same location several times, under clear skies, same equipment, same camera settings. Nothing. The sky was normal, no flickers, no glows, no patterns. I even tried shooting other areas of the sky. Still nothing. Only that one night captured the strange geometric pattern etched in the long exposure images and invisible to my own eyes. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a reflection in the lens that only became visible over longer exposures. Maybe some strange alignment of stars and clouds that night created an optical artifact I couldn't consciously perceive. Maybe it was something in my own perception, a kind of digital hallucination. But the geometry was too precise, too structured to be random. I showed the images to a friend, Claire, who's an amateur astrophysicist. She studied them for hours. She didn't give me any wild theories, only questions. Have you checked for satellites? Lens flare? Any chance it's your tripod or timer causing reflections? We ruled out all of that. She agreed it was unusual, but there was no scientific explanation we could pin down. The images remain on my hard drive. I sometimes load them up just to stare. The patterns never repeat in any future photos. I've been back to Pine Ridge countless nights since. Nothing. Normal stars, normal sky. I've tried to talk myself out of it, thinking maybe I misread the exposure, misalign something, or let imagination creep into reality. But when I look at the photos, the precision of those shapes is undeniable. I don't know what they were. I don't know why they appeared in the long exposure and not in my eyes. Every time I think about that night, I feel the same strange mix of awe and unease, like a puzzle that exists in a layer of reality I can't reach. I drive out there sometimes, camera ready, hoping to see a hint of it again. Nothing yet. Just the stars, scattered normally, silent and indifferent. I set up my tent on the ridge around 7:30 that evening. The snow had started falling lightly a few hours before, just enough to dust the pine branches and flatten the trails underfoot. I'd been planning this solo trip for weeks, just me, my backpack, and the quiet of the Colorado high country. No cell service for miles, just the occasional wind whistling through the pines. I liked that part. The isolation, the feeling that the world had shrunk down to the crunch of snow under my boots, and the warmth of the fire I'd built. The first night, I stayed close to the campsite, keeping the fire alive, roasting a can of beans, staring up at the clouded sky. Snowflakes glinted in the firelight as they drifted down, and I remember thinking how unreal the world looked. Shadows of trees dancing, branches bending under the weight of the snow, smoke rising from the fire and disappearing into the dark. I was half dozing when I noticed it. Something caught the firelight in the distance, maybe 150, 200 feet away. At first, I thought it was a deer. The way the snow reflected the light gave everything a sort of glow. But the reflection was too high off the ground, and it didn't move like an animal. I squinted through the falling snow, trying to make out a shape, anything recognizable. Nothing, just a shimmer that seemed to hang in the air for a moment before vanishing entirely. I shrugged. Must have been a trick of the firelight, the way snow reflects. I poked at the embers and shook my head, telling myself I was imagining things. But a nagging part of my brain made me keep looking toward that spot. There was a rhythm to the way it glimmered, sometimes faint, almost imperceptible, then bright enough to make the snow at the edge of my vision sparkle. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed my headlamp and my boots and started toward the shimmer, keeping the fire behind me for reference. The snow muffled my footsteps, crunching lightly under each step. My breath fogged in the air, freezing instantly on my jacket. As I got closer, I realized the glow was gone again. There was nothing in the clearing I had aimed for. No animal, no piece of metal, no light source. Just snow, undisturbed. I stood there for a few minutes, scanning, my headlamp beams swinging in arcs. Then I noticed it. A perfect circle in the snow, maybe 6 feet across, completely untouched. The snow was compressed slightly, but there were no footprints leading to or from it. It wasn't melted or scorched, just empty. like someone had stepped through the air and pressed the snow flat in a perfect outline. My stomach tightened. I walked around the edge, shining my light. No signs of anything, no tracks, no debris, nothing. I backed off slowly, thinking maybe it was an animal marking or a natural phenomenon I didn't understand. But nothing in that area looked disturbed, and the circle was impossibly regular. My rational mind told me to ignore it, to head back to camp, but I kept glancing at it over my shoulder as I returned. When I got back to the fire, I shook my head, tried to laugh, tried to tell myself the snow had simply fallen differently there. The wind compressed it in a circle. I spent the next hour sitting by the fire, trying to see if the shimmer would return. The wind had picked up, moving the pines and rattling my tent, and the snow fell heavier now. I thought I saw something again, a flash just beyond the tree line, a reflection off something smooth and metallic. I jumped to my feet, heart pounding, but when I ran toward it, there was nothing. Only more snow, undisturbed. The silence was almost suffocating, broken only by the occasional creak of ice and pine under snow. Sleep didn't come easily. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening. The wind outside sounded different somehow, the trees groaning and sighing, a subtle hum I couldn't place. I thought I heard it again, that shimmer of reflected light, but I didn't dare look. I kept my eyes closed, convincing myself it was all imagination. I drifted in fits of sleep, jerking awake every time I imagined movement outside the tent. Morning came gray and quiet. I zipped up and stepped out. My footprints from the previous night were crisp in the new snow, leading from the tent to the fire pit and out toward the clearing. I checked the circle. It was still there. The snow hadn't fallen evenly over it, like it was resistant somehow. Completely perfect, circular, untouched. I circled it slowly, photographing it from every angle. Even in daylight, it didn't make sense. There were no tracks leading away. No signs of disturbance. The snow inside the circle was solid, compacted, as if pressed down by something, but nothing had been there. I packed up quickly, feeling like I shouldn't linger. On the way down the trail, I kept glancing over my shoulder at the ridge, expecting some movement, a hint of shimmer, anything. Nothing. Just trees and snow, gray under a pale winter sun. I drove back to town later that day, stopping at the diner for coffee, telling the waitress it had snowed heavily on the ridge overnight. She nodded, distracted, but I could see the curiosity in her eyes when I mentioned camping alone. I didn't tell her about the circle. Couldn't. Even writing it down now, it feels impossible to explain. I've gone back to the same spot since, during different snowfalls, during clear nights, with no equipment, with cameras, trying to see anything unusual. Nothing. The circle hasn't appeared again. No shimmer, no light, no unbroken snow patches. It's as if it existed for that single night, and then the forest reclaimed it. I don't know what it was. I can't explain the shimmer I saw or the perfect circle in the snow. Every time I drive past that ridge in winter, I glance up, half expecting something to catch my eye. Something never does. But the memory is there, sharp and odd, an imprint of that night, a reminder that the world still holds things I don't understand. I was walking Daisy down the trail behind our house, the one that winds through the little patch of woods between Maple Street and the creek. It was early evening, the kind of August dusk where the air still holds the day's heat, but the shadows are creeping across the ground. I usually loved this time with Daisy. She sniffed everything, chased the occasional squirrel, and the trail was quiet enough that I could just wander without thinking. That night, though, something felt off the second we left the yard. Usually there's a constant hum of life here. Birds calling, insects buzzing, maybe a dog barking somewhere down the trail. But as we hit the tree line, it all stopped. Every sound. No chirping, no rustling leaves from small animals, nothing. Daisy froze mid-step, ears up, tail stiff. I stopped too, scanning the trees. I laughed nervously. Okay, weird, but maybe they're all asleep? Daisy didn't move, and I noticed how quiet the air felt, like someone had muted the world. Then I saw it. A faint, low light drifting over the treetops, pale and diffuse, not bright enough to light the trees fully, just there. Moving slowly, horizontally, like it was gliding above the canopy. I blinked, thinking it might be a plane or helicopter. But planes don't hover this low without noise, and helicopters make a goddamn racket. This was silent. Completely silent. And it didn't seem to be moving on a path. It followed the contour of the trees perfectly, drifting in small arcs as if watching the tree line rather than crossing it. I tugged Daisy gently back toward the trailhead. My phone was in my pocket, but I hesitated to pull it out, half afraid the light might disappear if I moved too fast. Daisy's breathing was shallow. She stayed close to my legs. The light didn't speed up or slow down, just drifted constant along the tops of the trees. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" My voice sounded ridiculous, echoing off nothing. Nothing answered, no rustle, no movement. The birds hadn't started again. Everything stayed completely still except for the faint glow. I decided to take a few steps off the trail toward a small clearing. Maybe it would be easier to see. As we got closer, the light seemed to pause, then shift slightly. Not toward us, but like it was aware of our movement. Every instinct told me to turn around and leave. I didn't. I don't know why. The clearing had a small pond I hadn't noticed before, reflecting the fading sky. And the light reflected too, but in a way that didn't make sense. There were no contours, no source, just a smear across the treetops mirrored perfectly on the water. I crouched slightly to get a better look, and that's when I realized Daisy wasn't whining or sniffing like she usually would. She was frozen, staring up at the light, muscles tense. Then something moved closer. Not from the ground, not walking, just descending slightly above the trees toward us. My heart rate spiked. I whispered, "Daisy, come on," grabbing her collar. The instant I touched her, the light pulsed faintly, brighter for a fraction of a second, and all of a sudden, every bird, every insect, every rustle of wildlife came back. The forest exploded with sound. I yanked Daisy toward the trail. We ran a few dozen feet before I dared to look back. The light was gone. No glow on the treetops, nothing in the clearing, just the normal shadows of branches swaying in the wind. I slowed down, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was a drone? Couldn't be. No sound, too fluid, too low. Could it have been a plane reflection? Something off the clouds? Maybe. But the way it had shifted when I moved Daisy, the way everything had gone silent at once, that didn't make sense. We stayed close to the trail until we were back in the open near the neighborhood. Daisy refused to sniff at anything, ears pressed back, tail tucked. I looked around for the light one last time. Nothing. Just street lamps in the distance, the hum of cars, and the usual evening sounds returning gradually. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept picturing the light gliding along the treetops, the sudden silence of the forest, the way Daisy had reacted. My mind kept running through explanations. Drone, satellite reflection, trick of the eyes. But I couldn't fit the silence, the way it seemed aware, the way it disappeared when I touched Daisy, into any logical narrative. The next morning, I walked the trail again. Nothing. Just squirrels calling, birds hopping from branch to branch, leaves rustling. I tried to retrace where the light had moved, looking for footprints, drone parts, anything. There was nothing. No trace at all. I told a friend about it later, someone who'd done a lot of night hikes. He suggested it could have been swamp gas, some kind of optical illusion over the water. Maybe. But I've hiked here dozens of times, dusk and night, and nothing like that has ever happened. That silence, the movement, the reflection on the pond, none of it lines up with anything I've read about or experienced. I went back weeks later, hoping for an explanation, for maybe some mundane cause. I never saw the light again. The forest sounded normal. Daisy ran ahead without hesitation. But sometimes when I pass the tree line in the evening, I swear I feel that pause in the air, a faint hum, the way everything seemed to freeze that night. And every time I glance at the treetops, I half expect to see a shimmer, gliding silently just above, waiting. I can't explain it. Nothing makes sense. But I know what I saw, what Daisy sensed, and how the world fell completely silent around us. Whatever it wasn't normal. I woke up to the sound of birds, which is normal for me since I keep my windows open in the spring. But when I rolled over and glanced out the bedroom window, something immediately felt off. My backyard didn't look wrong at first, just the usual patchy grass, tomato plants starting to leaf out, and a few wildflowers I hadn't gotten around to weeding. But then I noticed the tomatoes, and the peppers, and the basil. All of them were rearranged. Not in any casual sense, like I'd walked through and brushed them a little while watering. No, they were organized, perfectly, in concentric circles around a small patch in the center of the yard. The plants weren't bent or damaged. They weren't uprooted. Nothing was missing, just moved. Precise, symmetrical circles, like someone had taken a compass and measured it all out. I blinked and rubbed my eyes. Maybe I was dreaming. I've had dreams where I water plants and come back to find they've grown 10 feet overnight or turned colors. But the light in the backyard was natural, dawn light, gray and soft. It wasn't dreamlike. I got out of bed and went to the window again, staring for a while. The soil in the circles looked the same as the surrounding soil. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. I opened the sliding door slowly and stepped outside barefoot, grass cold and wet under my feet. Every circle was perfect, not a single plant out of line. My first thought was my neighbor. Roger's a practical guy, always tinkering in his garage. Maybe he'd wandered into my yard trying some kind of experiment. But then I remembered, the circles weren't random. They spiraled outward from the center, spacing identical from one circle to the next. No human would do that without measuring tools, and even then, it'd be hard to get that precise without leaving some evidence, footprints, flattened grass, something. I started pacing around the yard, looking for anything else. The garden gnome was untouched. My compost bin hadn't been moved. Even the small rock path that cut through the herb bed was exactly where it should be. Nothing else felt wrong, exactly. Just the circles. I called my friend Tanya, a botanist at Iowa State, to see if she could make sense of it. I figured she'd laugh or tell me plants can somehow self-arrange overnight. She didn't laugh. She sounded a little tense. Concentric circles, she asked. Like perfect ones? Yeah, not a plant out of place. Nothing's dead, nothing's uprooted. It's just moved. There was a pause. Then she said, that's not natural. No plants do that, not by themselves. And unless someone had a surveyor's level and some serious patience, there's no way it was human either. I hung up, unsettled. Part of me wanted to ignore it, tell myself I was seeing patterns where there were none. But that didn't explain the subtle differences in the soil. The ground inside the circles seemed slightly more compacted, almost like it had been pressed down but not trampled, not like a footprint. More uniform. I spent the morning taking pictures, every angle, every layer of circles. Even zoomed in, I couldn't see any sign of disturbance. No debris, no broken stems, nothing. Just perfect geometry. Later that afternoon, I went to water the garden. I left the hose running across the lawn while I went to grab the nozzle, and when I returned, the circles were still there. I squatted next to one, reaching out to brush a leaf, and the plant felt normal. Soil soft, roots intact. Everything seemed alive and fine. By the evening, I had started questioning my own memory. Maybe I'd done it myself in a half-asleep state. But that didn't explain the center point, a tiny patch of bare dirt, perfectly round, about the size of a dinner plate, right in the middle. I'm meticulous about planting. If I wanted bare dirt there, I'd have planned it. But I didn't. I checked the security camera footage from the front of the house. Nothing. No one entering, no cars stopping, no shadows moving across the yard. The only movement was me stepping into frame to check the mailbox. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept imagining the circles expanding, spiraling outward until they covered the yard or the whole neighborhood. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw them, precise and unbroken, stretching into infinity. The next morning, the circles were still there. I didn't touch them. I just stared for a long time from the kitchen window, drinking coffee I didn't really taste. Everything else in the yard looked normal. Birds landing on the fence, the wind moving the tree branches. But the circles stayed perfect, almost glowing in the soft sunlight. I asked Roger if he'd seen anything unusual. He was fishing in the creek with his grandson, not paying attention. I asked if he'd done any experiments, anything with lights or measuring tools. He shook his head. Not a thing, Nick. I swear. Why? I didn't tell him the whole truth. I just said something about strange frost patterns I'd read about in the Midwest, mostly jokes online. He shrugged and went back to fishing. For the rest of the week, I avoided the backyard as much as possible. I watered from a distance, let the hose dangle over the edge. The circles stayed the same. I tried not to think about it, tried to rationalize. Maybe a new fungus that affects plant growth in a radial pattern. Maybe frost damage reversed by early morning sun. Maybe a prank I hadn't caught on video, but I couldn't get past the symmetry. Perfect circles, perfect spacing. Nothing missing, nothing dead, no signs of human or animal intervention, and no sound, no vibration, no hum in the air. I started keeping a journal, just notes on the plants, their health, any changes in light, wind, temperature, but nothing changed except that my anxiety grew. Sometimes late at night, I'd get up to glance out the window, and the circles seemed slightly brighter under the streetlights, like they were aware I was watching. It was probably just my imagination, but I'd catch my breath anyway. By the second week, I went outside carefully and measured the circles. Each ring was identical in width, the center perfectly aligned with the corner post of the shed. I even used a string to check the radius of each circle. Every measurement was exact to the millimeter. I've tried to rationalize it truly. Maybe it's some weird natural phenomenon, maybe some animal or insect I don't understand. But nothing I know of moves plants in precise geometric patterns overnight. Nothing. Eventually, I stopped measuring and just accepted the yard as it was. The circles remained unmoving, unaffected by wind or rain. The plants thrived. My tomatoes produced as usual. Basil smelled sweet in the mornings. And still, when I step outside and look down at the perfect spirals, I feel like I'm not alone, even though no one has been there. I haven't tried to recreate it, and I haven't told anyone else except Tanya. And even then, she just shakes her head and says, "I don't know, Nick." I still wake up some mornings thinking I'll find them gone. But they're always there, waiting as precise as the day I first saw them. The storm started around 7. I was out on my porch in my raincoat, just trying to let the dog stretch his legs before everything got too wet. The wind was already picking up, whipping through the pines behind my house, and the first streaks of lightning split the sky in the distance. I remember thinking how quiet the forest sounded, even over the rain. Usually the wind makes the trees groan and snap, but this time it was just rain on leaves and an eerie hush between thunderclaps. I had the flashlight on my phone, shining it across the yard for Gus, who was already looking suspiciously alert. He paused mid-step, ears forward, staring toward the tree line. I followed his gaze, expecting maybe a raccoon or a deer caught in the storm. That's when the lightning struck. It was just a single flash, sharp and bright, and for that one instant, I saw it. A dark, hovering shape above the tops of the trees. It wasn't huge, maybe 10 or 15 feet across, and it had no features, no lights, no sound, just there, hanging in the air, still against the gray storm clouds. The shape seemed to absorb the lightning for a second before the sky went back to dark. I blinked, and it was gone, completely. Just rain, wind, and the forest. But that moment had frozen me. I couldn't move at first. Gus barked once, low and short, like he was warning me or asking me what the hell I was looking at. I told him, "It's okay, buddy. It's okay." I didn't believe it myself. I stayed on the porch for a while, scanning the tree line. That's when I noticed it. The tops of some of the trees where I thought the shape had hovered were bent outward, like something had passed through them. Not broken, just pressed, branches splayed in a strange, unnatural angle. I stepped closer to inspect, but my rain boots squelched in the mud and it was hard to see much in the dim light. The rain got heavier. Wind picked up and the storm rolled over us again, lightning flashing in jagged lines across the sky. Every time I thought I saw the shape again, it was gone. Only the trees gave any sign that something had passed above them. And the feeling, it was like the air had shifted. Denser, charged. I could almost hear a low hum, though the storm itself made so much noise, it could have been my imagination. I ran inside, closing the door behind me, Gus shaking water all over the entryway. My hands were trembling. I considered calling the neighbors, but it was late and raining, and I didn't want to sound crazy. Instead, I grabbed my binoculars and sat by the window, watching. Nothing moved in the storm beyond the usual rain/trees. Still, I kept looking. After a few minutes, I went back outside under the small overhang of the porch. The storm had passed over the yard, but was still pounding out in the distance. I walked toward the tree line, careful with each step. The trees were definitely bent outward, more than I remembered from the first glance. Some of the smaller ones were pressed into the ground, leaves slick with water, needles sticking together unnaturally. It was subtle, nothing obvious, but the pattern was there. Like a path had been carved through the tops of the trees. invisible from the ground, but noticeable if you looked for it. I started marking them in my notebook, sketching the positions, the angles. My brain refused to let me believe it was human, and the thought of any kind of crane or helicopter passing that low in this storm felt ridiculous. Not to mention there were no tracks in the mud, no footprints, no tire marks, nothing. By the time the storm moved away completely, the sky was bruised purple and black, rain tapering into drizzle. I stayed out there, walking slowly along the perimeter of the tree line, examining the bent branches. Gus was quiet now, ears flat, tail low, following me like he understood something was wrong. Later that night, I checked the tree line with a flashlight again. From the porch, everything seemed normal in the darkness, but up close, the bending of the branches was still there. The wind had shifted again, rustling the trees in a way that made the marks look like they might straighten out on their own, but didn't, not entirely. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not by another person, no, that's different, but by something aware, somewhere above or beyond the tree line. Every shadow looked like it might move against the wind. Every patch of dark between the trees seemed deeper than it should be. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept imagining that shape hovering silently, almost tasting the air, waiting for something. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it again, perfectly still against the storm-lit sky. And the trees, the ones it had passed over, bent outward in that impossible, subtle way, as if the shape had weight but no substance, pressing through the branches without touching the ground. The next morning I checked again. The marks were still there, slightly swaying with the morning breeze, rainwater dripping off the tips, but the shape? Gone. No trace. The sky was clear over the pines, blue and ordinary. I even walked deeper into the woods to see if I'd find tracks, evidence, anything. Nothing. Weeks passed and life went back to normal, mostly. I still took the dog out every morning, peering up at the tree line. Sometimes, just at the corner of my vision, I thought I saw a shadow moving against the clouds. Nothing definite, but the trees remained bent outward, an unspoken reminder that whatever had passed there had weight and presence and was human. I never told anyone besides a coworker who asked about the storm. I described the wind and rain, mentioned the strange bending, and left it at that. He nodded politely, probably thought I was exaggerating. Maybe I was. But the trees don't lie. Every time I walk past them, I see the slight curve of branches pointing outward, like a message I can't read. Gus still flinches when a storm rolls in, ears flat, low growl. Me, I glance at the sky more than I used to, scanning the clouds and the darkening horizon. Sometimes I swear I catch the faintest outline of something drifting high above the tree line, then gone the moment I blink. And the trees, I check them every time, half expecting them to straighten, but they never do. They're bent outward, silent, permanent. I can't explain it. Not really. I try to rationalize, but nothing fits. Helicopter? Plane? Storm damage? Nothing leaves branches bent outward in such a precise path, hovering weightless above the forest. All I know is what I saw and what's still there, bending silently in the wind. Waiting. I was driving back from Des Moines to Council Bluffs late one night in early March. It was close to midnight, cold enough that the edges of the windshield had a thin layer of frost creeping in. I'd spent the evening visiting my sister, and since it was a Sunday, the highway was almost empty. Just me, some distant semi-headlights, and the low hum of the heater fighting to keep the cabin warm. Somewhere around Avoca, I noticed a light out in the distance, off the highway, maybe half a mile into a field. At first, I thought it was a tractor or maybe a yard light on a tall pole, but it didn't look right. It wasn't stationary like a lamp, and it wasn't moving like a vehicle either. It just hovered there, bright, perfectly circular, and pure white. I slowed down a little, thinking maybe I was just tired and misjudging distance. The weird part was how sharp it looked. Usually when you see a light far away through the cold night air, it scatters a bit. This one didn't. It was crisp, solid, almost too defined. When I passed the next exit, I pulled off onto a service road that ran parallel to the highway. It curved around and opened onto a dirt road that cut between two big fields. I parked on the shoulder, turned off the engine, and rolled the window down. The air was freezing, my breath turning white in the dim dashboard glow. I sat there for a second, listening. I expected to hear a generator or a cow mooing or wind moving through the grass, but it was silent. Not quiet. Silent. No insects, no dogs barking in the distance, nothing. Even the faint sound of traffic behind me seemed muted, like the air itself was thick. The light was maybe 200 yards out. It hovered just above the ground, maybe 15 feet up. I couldn't see any structure or pole holding it. It didn't cast light outward like a spotlight either. It just glowed evenly, like a sphere with its own soft halo. And right beneath it, the ground looked wrong. It's hard to explain. It looked like the air above the field was bending, kind of like heat shimmer on asphalt, except it was barely 20 degrees out. The rest of the field was coated in frost and dead grass, but that patch directly under the light had this blurry, wavering look. I grabbed my phone and stepped out of the car. The cold hit immediately, cutting through my jeans. I walked around to the front bumper and leaned against it, watching the thing. My heart wasn't racing or anything yet. I was just trying to figure out what it could be. Some kind of drone, maybe? But there was no sound, and if it was a drone, it would have had to be huge to give off that much light. After a minute, I realized it wasn't completely still. It was moving, just barely, like it was swaying in a slow, deliberate pattern. Not random, more like it was tracing something, yeah, like invisible lines in the air. I don't know why that made me uncomfortable, but it did. I took a photo. It came out almost black except for this solid white orb and the faint outline of my car headlights reflecting on the gravel. When I zoomed in, I noticed the edges of the light weren't smooth. They had this faint geometric shape to them, like hexagons layered on top of each other, too faint to see with the naked eye but visible on the photo. That's when I started to feel uneasy. I turned off my phone flashlight and just stood there for another minute, watching the field. I swear I could hear something low and constant, like a hum right at the edge of hearing. The kind that's so deep you almost feel it more than hear it. It made the fillings in my teeth buzz a little. I thought maybe I should just get back in the car, but right before I did, the light began to rise. Slowly, smoothly. It went up maybe 20 more feet, then stopped. The shimmer on the ground widened, stretching outward in a perfect circle. And that's when I noticed something that still bothers me. The frost on the field stopped abruptly at the edge of that circle, like someone had drawn it with a compass. Inside it, the grass was darker, almost damp-looking. I couldn't see any movement, but it looked freshly thawed. Then everything changed at once. The hum stopped. The light blinked out completely. Just gone. No fade out, no movement upward. Darkness slammed in like someone had flipped a switch. I stood there for a few seconds, waiting for my eyes to adjust, staring at where it had been. And then, in the quiet, I heard something soft, a single pop, like air releasing from a jar. After that, the frost began to form again right where the circle had been, starting from the edges, and creeping inward like time-lapse footage of ice spreading. Within 30 seconds, the patch was gone. Just the same flat field as before. I didn't see or hear anything else after that. I climbed back into the kerned on the heat and just sat there staring at the field. I didn't even check the photo again until I got home. The drive back felt longer than it should have. I remember thinking it was odd how empty the road was. I didn't see another car the entire stretch between exits. When I pulled into my driveway, my phone said 3:42 a.m. I remember checking because I'd left my sister's place a little before midnight, and the whole drive was supposed to be 2 hours, maybe a bit more. I went straight inside, sat on the couch, and looked at the picture again. The geometric pattern was still there, clearer now that I was looking in better light. The light wasn't round after all. It was made of repeating shapes that almost looked like panes of glass, layered and overlapping. I took a few screenshots, trying to zoom in without blurring it too much. Then, when I went back to my gallery, the photo wasn't there. I don't mean it deleted itself or anything, it just wasn't in the same spot. I found it later in an older folder I hadn't opened in months, like it had been saved in the wrong place. A few nights later, I drove the same stretch again just to see. The field looked normal, no sign of burnt grass or thawed patches, just the same frost-covered dirt, the same barbed wire fence. I parked at the same spot for a while, but nothing happened. I told my sister about it the next day. She thought it might have been a helicopter or a drone from one of the farms. maybe some testing thing. But I know what I saw. There was no sound, no downwash of air, and the ground didn't move like that from heat. I still have the photo on my phone. I've never posted it anywhere or shown anyone else. Every time I open it, it looks a little different. Not like it's changing, just like the shapes shift depending on how long I look at them. Sometimes they look perfectly symmetrical. Other times, they look like they're bending around something invisible. It's probably just the compression or my eyes playing tricks. But when I open the photo in the dark, it feels like the light isn't just in the image. It feels like it's behind the screen, deeper somehow. I haven't stopped along that stretch of highway since. I drive through, keep my eyes forward, and don't look at the fields anymore. There's nothing there to see. I left my apartment in Ashford around 11 at night, figuring the drive to my parents' place in Willow Creek would take just over an hour. I'd done this route hundreds of times, mostly through the same two-lane roads that cut across farmland and low hills. The sky was clear, the moon bright enough that I didn't even need my headlights at first. I had the GPS on, but mostly as a backup. About 20 minutes out, I noticed the first weird thing. My GPS, which usually tracked me perfectly along the road, started showing a little green line veering off the highway, cutting across what it claimed were fields. I glanced up at the road. Nothing. Just asphalt, trees, and the occasional farmhouse with lights on. I shrugged, figured it was a glitch. The little blue arrow on the map jumped back to the road a few seconds later. Then it happened again, a few miles later. The map showed me turning off onto a dirt path between two large fields that didn't exist. I looked around. No path, no fields, just the same rolling hills and dark tree line. I tapped the screen, thinking maybe I'd hit a wrong setting. The arrow jumped back to the main road, but something about the way it had drawn the path straight through areas that were clearly dense forest made my stomach tighten. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I'd been staring at the GPS too long and my brain was seeing things. I kept driving. A few minutes later, the screen glitched again, this time showing me crossing what looked like a small river and then a narrow bridge. My headlights caught a flash of reflection on the road, and for a split second, I thought I saw a bridge ahead. But there was nothing, just the familiar stretch of road curving gently to the left. I slowed down, trying to stay calm. Maybe it was some glitch in the map data, maybe a software update I didn't know about. But the glitches were becoming more detailed. Little clusters of houses appeared on the screen where there were only cornfields, fences that curved impossibly through open ground, tiny roads that didn't exist. Every time the map corrected itself, the areas would vanish like they'd never been there. Then the GPS did something I've never seen before. The arrow moved off the road entirely, heading into a dense area of what it now claimed was forest. I blinked, staring through the windshield into the darkness. There was nothing but the familiar tree line, maybe 100 feet away. My heart started to race. I thought about pulling over, but the shoulders were narrow, and I didn't want to risk stopping on a road this dark. I kept driving slowly. My headlights swept across the trees, trying to find anything. A sign, a path, a break in the forest. Nothing. But the GPS still showed me moving along this non-existent path, twisting and turning through what looked like thick woods and open meadows. I could see the moonlight catch on something in the map's depiction. A pond, maybe, or a small clearing. That's when I noticed it in real life. A faint shimmer off to the side of the road. It looked like heat waves, distorted air, the way it would ripple if something was standing just beyond the tree line. I swerved slightly to avoid it, but there was nothing there. No noise, no movement. Just the same still darkness and the faint, empty shimmer. I tried calling my mom, figured maybe if I talked to someone it would help. No signal. No bars at all. Even the GPS app went blank for a few seconds, then returned to the glitching map, showing me moving through forests and open fields that simply didn't exist. I started feeling disoriented. My eyes hurt from staring at the bright screen against the darkness, my hands tensed on the wheel. I tried to focus on the road, counting trees and curves, anything familiar. The GPS showed me now crossing a small hill, then a stream, then another hill, all of which weren't physically there. And then something changed. The map arrow slowed down. My headlights caught movement on the roadside, a shadow, maybe, or a figure. I slammed on the brakes. Nothing. The tree line was empty, still, silent. The GPS jumped again, correcting itself to the real road but for a moment, that shadow lingered in my mind, frozen, watching. I started driving faster, trying to shake the unease, telling myself it was exhaustion, that maybe I'd imagined the shimmer and the shadow. But then the GPS glitched again, and I swear the green line was now weaving around hills and through forests in ways that would be impossible for any car. I felt like I was moving through a place that shouldn't exist, like my vehicle was threading through a secret landscape layered over the real one. The clock on the dashboard read 12:47 a.m., 47 a.m. when the GPS finally stabilized, snapping me back to the main road. I checked my phone. The battery was at 70%, and the map now showed only the familiar road to Willow Creek. I pressed on, trying to breathe normally. That's when I noticed the first light of dawn, soft pink and orange along the horizon. I glanced at the clock again. 4:15 a.m., I didn't understand it. I had no recollection of the hours between 12:47 and 4:15. The stretch of road I had just driven should have taken maybe 30 minutes. I checked every turn, every mile marker. Nothing. No debris, no signs of detours, just the straight highway leading into town, as if I'd driven it normally. But the time was gone, missing. I pulled into my parents' driveway at 4:18 a.m., Daisy asleep in the backseat after having stayed in the apartment with me earlier that evening. The street was empty, peaceful, normal. I could see the barn lights on the property, the same barn I'd passed dozens of times before. Everything looked exactly as it should. I told my parents I'd been tired, that the drive had felt longer than usual. They didn't question it. The next day, I checked the GPS history, hoping for some data. There was a single straight track from my apartment to Willow Creek. No deviations, no forest paths, no rivers, no hills that shouldn't exist. It was like the last few hours of the drive never happened at all. I've driven that route a dozen more times since. Nothing like it has happened again. The roads are the same, the fields the same, the forests in the same places. But sometimes at night, when I glance at the GPS, I can't help but feel a flicker of hesitation. A line might shimmer off the road through places that shouldn't exist, waiting for me to follow. I don't know what it was, a glitch, a hallucination, something else entirely. All I know is that for those hours, I was somewhere I couldn't map, somewhere the real and the unreal overlapped, and when I returned, the dawn was already waiting for me. My phone buzzed on the table, and when I looked down, it was Mark's name on the screen with a single message. You need to see this. Now. He lived 3 houses down, a guy I'd worked with for years, and trusted to not prank me over something dumb. I unlocked my screen and walked outside to the backyard while he called. He met me at the gate with his hands full of trash bags and a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "This is weird," he said, and when he took my phone back to cue the clip, his fingers were shaking just enough that I could see it. The video was shot vertically like a quick phone job, and the first thing I saw was our backyard at night. My fence, my shed, the swing set, and then a soft, steady glow hovering above the grass. It didn't pulse or flicker. It sat in one place like someone had held a lamp in the dark and refused to let it move. Mark didn't narrate. He didn't need to. He tapped the play bar forward and back to show me the moment again. In the clip, the light stayed fixed as if the world around it had been edited out. The shadows it made on the lawn were oddly clean, no sway from leaves, no interruption from the telephone wire overhead. The video had depth. You could tell it was over the lawn, not a reflection on the shed. For a few seconds, I forgot to breathe. "Where did you shoot that from?" I asked. "By the side of the driveway. I walked down to take the bins out and saw it through your fence. Thought I should call you. Thought you'd want to look." He swallowed and then muttered, "It's not a drone." No sound. We watched it twice more, slow and then at normal speed. The file lagged on the last frame, as if the phone couldn't decide whether to keep the glow in memory. Then Mark hit stop, and his face tightened. "I saved it," he said, "but I want you to see it again before I delete it from my phone, in case it messes with anything." He handed the phone back, and I watched him scroll to the clip and play it. The same soft white orb hovered above my grass, indifferent. When it ended, I handed the phone back to him. He swore he'd email it to me. He said he'd copy it to his laptop. He said he'd back it up. He said all the things you say when you're trying to make something real. An hour later, I texted Mark and asked if he'd sent it. No reply. At 2 the next morning, I knocked on his door. He opened it bleary-eyed and shaking his head. "It's gone," he said without preamble. "I had it. It was here. I swear. I went to show Jenna and the file wasn't there on my phone anymore." He swiped through his camera roll anyway. There were photos of his kids, a sushi receipt, a blurry selfie from last week, no clip from my yard. He checked his cloud backup and the folder that would have held it. Empty. That was the start of it, the thing that made the night feel like something you'd only half enter. You saw something impossible. Everyone agreed that it had been there, and then the small piece of evidence unspooled like a cheap film. There were signs before that night, little things should have paid better attention to and didn't. The porch light had been going dim and bright for a week. Nothing terrible, just a slow stutter at odd hours that I replaced with a new bulb and swore it wouldn't do it again. Winston, my Labrador, had taken to staring at the back fence at night, ears flat, tail tucked, but when I went outside there was never anything to see. My neighbor, Tanya, told me on Tuesday that she'd woken to her phone buzzing at 3 a.m. with a weather alert that showed a radar pause over our block for exactly 7 minutes. She shrugged it off as a glitch. I kept thinking, that's tech for you. It always does odd things. Between Mark's video and his sudden loss of it, things escalated in ways that were small and specific. The porch camera, the cheap unit I'd stapled up last summer, had a corrupted file the morning after Mark's show and tell. The motion log said activity at 1:12 a.m. Just a white frame. One frame, then nothing. The camera rebooted itself and showed nothing else. I pulled the SD card and plugged it into my laptop. The file was listed, but 0 bytes. The software threw errors when I tried to repair it. Card corrupted, it said, and I canned the message like bad advice. I went a week feeling like I'd slipped sideways into an alternate routine where ordinary objects misbehaved. My phone's battery ran down faster than it should. The microwave clock blinked 1:13 a.m. for 2 mornings despite being plugged in and working the rest of the day. Winston refused to go out after sunset, and when he did, he pulled like someone else was holding the leash. I started doing the little things you do to anchor yourself. I checked all the windows before bed. I wrote down the time when I walked the dog. I texted Mark and asked if he'd tried a different phone or computer to transfer the file. He said he had, and that every copy vanished the same way. Present 1 second, gone the next. I tried to be methodical. I borrowed an external drive from work and asked my neighbor Lisa if she'd copy anything she had that night, just in case. She hadn't filmed a thing, but she'd looked out and seen my backyard bathed in a mild light for a few minutes. "Like a yard party you didn't know about," she said. Then it stopped, and the whole street smelled weird, kind of like when someone burns copper. She frowned when she said it, like saying it made it more real. We checked the street for physical effects. There were none obvious. No scorch marks, no melted grass, no obvious footprints. In the morning, the lawn looked as it always did, a bit patchy near the swing set. But on the strip of grass near the center of the yard, exactly where the video had shown the glow hovering, I noticed the dew had been pushed down in a tidy oval the size of a coffee table. I ran my hand through it and felt nothing more than the cool dampness of condensed water. The ground underneath felt normal. That lack of damage bothered me more than any burn mark might have. It suggested something that could enter the world quietly and not touch it, like an animal that took only the sound of itself. It made me imagine the light being patient, waiting for the right moment when no one was looking directly, and then leaving without a trace. Mark grew more agitated. He checked and rechecked his phone like someone looking for a letter that might appear in the mailbox at any moment. He called Jenna's parents to ask whether they'd seen anything on their cameras. Nothing. He even tried to bring me the phone and show me where the clip had been stored, but by then the icon for the file was an empty rectangle. His cloud account showed a 0-byte file with the right name and the wrong timestamp. I did what people do. I started to collect coincidences. The streetlight at the corner, newly installed last fall, blinked out for an hour the night after Mark's file disappeared. The radio in my truck cut to static for a full minute while I was pausing at the stoplight where the drive meets the main road. On a Thursday, the neighbor's cat Simon came scratching at my door, soaking wet though it hadn't rained. His fur left a ring on the welcome mat that, when wiped, smelled faintly metallic. There are ways to explain all of that. There are always ways. Electromagnetic interference, a failing sensor, some idiot with a box truck with extra lighting. It's nervous to say you don't have an explanation, because people like to fix things with explanations. I'm the kind of person who likes to name causes and knock them down one by one, but the harder I looked, the less tidy the answers became. One evening, Mark knocked on my door again, eyes hollow, and thrust his phone forward. I didn't believe it, he said, but 2 nights ago, I saw it again. He swore he'd put the phone in airplane mode and taped it under the dash while he filmed. He handed it to me and I watched. The clip began with his driveway, then a white glow above my backyard appeared. It hung, then tilted as if the light had a top and a bottom, and for a breath, we watched it breathe. My hands were cold when the file ended. I asked to keep the phone. He looked relieved and let me take it home to copy it to every device I could borrow. I sat in the glow of the laptop and dragged files onto external drives like a man who thinks the act of copying is the same as preserving. The file transferred. I opened it. Black. I looked at the file name. The timestamp had changed from 11:02 p.m. to 3:03 a.m. The file size was 0. I checked the file properties like you check a stopped clock, expecting it to start again. I called Mark. He answered on the first ring. "It's like it never existed," he said. "I swear, Aaron, I could swear." He told me about a smell after the light left, sharp and coppery, that made his mouth taste like pennies. And my dog Benny woke up the next day with his collar warm as if someone had been touching it. I started, leaving my laptop on a chair facing the backyard at night, with the external drive connected and the software set to record anything the webcam could see. I left the audio running as a dumb, stubborn machine that might catch something human ears missed. I put the phone on airplane mode and slid it into a Tupperware container on the table. Little rituals to try to stop the evaporation of evidence. Dogs barked across the street sometimes, and the distant sound of an ATV woke me once. By 3 a.m, I was too tired for vigilance. When I pulled the footage the next morning, the files were there and showed the expected grainy darkness. At 2:58 a.m. there was, according to the timestamp, a white frame. The camera's clock matched my laptop's clock, but the frame was just that, a white square. The video resumed with nothing unusual. The audio had a couple of seconds of a low hum, nothing like thunder, more like the vibration of a distant transformer, but the levels were within normal background noise. I replayed it until my eyes blurred. I stopped telling the story to people who didn't already know. Their faces went polite at the edges when I described the file behaving like a living thing, appearing and disappearing by whim. Maybe it was an artifact, one friend offered. Maybe some compression bug. That answer asked me to believe my eyes and not my hands. There are other small things I'll write down because they mattered to me in the moment. The way my kettle hissed a little higher that week, like it wanted to make noise. The odd way Winston refused to sleep outside, though he loves the porch. The way my watch sometimes read 3:03 after I'd checked it at 11. I kept a list because it made me feel like I was doing something concrete. We never got the video back. Mark's phone was fine otherwise, no other corrupt files, no missing photos, but the clip from my backyard was a hole, and the hole seemed to have a memory of light. He swore he'd tried the shop that specializes in recovery. They ran a dozen tests and sent us a polite email that said files could not be recovered from a 0-byte placeholder. They suggested we preserve the device and not use it to overwrite any potential sectors. We did what we could and then stopped because there isn't much to do beyond that. At night, I find myself standing at the kitchen window more often, not exactly looking for anything but listening for the hush that came before the light. Sometimes, years later, I still slow down when I pass the back gate and glance at the strip of grass where the dew pressed into the soil. It looks like any suburban yard. Nothing else stands out. The neighbors' kids play, the sprinklers come on at dawn. Life keeps its ordinary rhythms. I don't have a picture to show anyone now. I have only the memory of Mark's phone in his hand, the way the video looked, and how we both instinctively reached for proof that we could touch. I also have the memory of the file gone, not lost to human error, not corrupted in the usual way, but absent as if someone had decided the world didn't need another record. Maybe it was a trick of technology. Maybe it was the way some nights fold into others in these neighborhoods, full of cars and radio waves and lights. Or maybe it was something small and patient that hovered long enough to register on a camera and then chose to be unrecorded. I don't know which explanation troubles me more, that something happened and vanished without trace, or that my devices simply refused to keep its memory from me. Either way, I kept the external drive plugged in for months. That's out of habit more than hope. And when friends asked, I told the same story, leaving out the part where I check my phone at night to make sure a stupid file doesn't blink out while I'm sleeping. I woke up with the room bright but not like morning, like the blue of a phone screen pressed against your eyelids times 10. My blinds were shut all the way. I knew because I always sleep with them latched down, the cheap Velcro on the edges making that little sound when you pull it. I sat up, heart doing the dumb thing it does when you realize something is off, and the light slid across the ceiling in a soft, slow wash. It wasn't harsh. It was more like someone had set a pale blue lamp behind the house and left it on, except there was no lamp and the sound of the world was wrong. When I pushed the blankets down, the smell hit me. Ozone, sharp and metallic, like after a lightning strike, but no thunder. It made the back of my throat fizz. I leaned toward the window and touched the slats. Cold vinyl. No gap. The light didn't change when I tapped them. It just kept bleeding under the edges, painting the curtains that color you get in an X-ray film. I checked my phone on the nightstand. The screen lit and went black and lit again like it couldn't decide. Battery read 42%. That felt wrong. I'd put it on the charger at 11, and I always keep it topped off. The clock said 3:07 a.m. I shut it off because I didn't want the little glow messing with my eyes, and stood there in the blue, breathing shallow, trying to pretend it was some power transformer somewhere. I told myself the smell would go in a minute and that I'd laugh about being spooked in the morning. The cabin creaks at night. This place does that. Thin floorboards, old insulation, so I listened for familiar noises the way someone checks locks. But that night there was nothing besides the light. No gulls, no distant boat motors, nothing. It felt like the house had been put in a bubble. After a few minutes, my knees decided they were tired of being propped on the bed. I went to the kitchen, passing the little living room window that looks toward the rocks. The blue seeped out under the blinds there too, softer. The kettle on the stove, cold, showed a thin film of condensation on the spout like frost. I flicked the overhead and the bulb hummed in a way it doesn't, a tremor under the pitch. The digital clock on the microwave had blinked 3:07 as well, and now it read 3:09. Somewhere in my head I reached for explanations. Failing charger, a transformer surge, some neighbor with a spotlight, but none of those fit. On the way back through the hallway, I rounded the bookshelf and nearly tripped over the dog. Rosie had been asleep low to the floor, but she'd lifted her head and was staring at the ceiling, ears pricked, the collar tag hanging still. She made that little anxious sound she makes when thunder's coming, and it made my palms sweat. I crouched down and she pressed her shoulder under my hand like she wanted an anchor. Animals react before we do. I knew that. If she was keyed up, that said something. I opened the back door a crack and the blue thinned out like someone mellowed a projection. Outside the deck rail, the ocean was black, flat, nothing reflecting back. No lights out on the water. The air tasted like the harbor where the fishing boats keep their lines, but cleaner, with that faint tang of electricity. The neighbors' houses up the hill were dark. Shutters closed. I closed the door again, and the smell stayed a beat longer, like a note that doesn't quite stop. I tried to call the town line at the marina to ask if someone was running a floodlight, but my phone wouldn't connect. Calls spun and dropped. The landline by the kitchen wasn't much help either. A thin ticking and then dead silence. For a minute, I had the ridiculous image of the whole town going into a collective power nap and me being the last one awake in a blue-lit world. The smell faded finally, like someone rolled up a window and pulled it away. The light didn't snap off. It softened and retreated toward the window strips until only the corner of the curtain was washed. By the time the sun cracked the horizon, the color was gone and the room looked like itself again, neutral and mostly normal. Rosie collapsed with a big sigh and went back to sleep. I sat on the couch with my mug and tried to count something logical. There were little odd things that had happened all week, and I hadn't put them together until that moment. The porch motion sensor had pinged my phone twice at 2:50 a.m. on Monday, and then nothing showed on the camera, just a corrupted white frame. My refrigerator had hummed louder than usual on Tuesday night, and my neighbor, Tom, had texted me at midnight saying his dog went nuts for 15 minutes, then quieted. I thought those were coincidences. Now they looked like preface. I walked up to Tom's house later that morning. He's the only person, as far as I can call, with any consistency. Knows the tide book, knows when the ferries are late. He was on his porch in a flannel, and he blinked when I told him about the blue light. "Funny you mention it," he said. "I thought I was imagining things." My son came in crying at 3 and asked if the sky had turned blue. I figured fireworks from the festival, but it was weird quiet too. He rubbed his jaw like the time he'd woken to foghorns on a glass sea. Smelled like metal here too. Kinda like when the transformer on Main gets cooked, but there was no outage. We walked the lane, and I noticed the roadside grass flattened in a neat crescent near the lower rocks. No scorch marks, no singed edges, just the way dew sits when something heavy has pressed it down and left it. When I crouched, the blades popped up under my fingers as if they'd been used but not damaged. Ordinary, unusual. That was the phrase that kept circling in my head. That afternoon, I went to the harbor to see if any of the fishing guys had seen anything. Dan at the bait shop poured coffee like it was an act of faith and listened while I described the room glow and the smell. "We saw some weirding on the radio that night," he said, wiping his hands on his apron. "Faint buzz on the VHF for like 10 minutes. Guys on deck thought maybe the storm was back, but no cloud." He told me a story about the lights on a buoy going white for a sliver and then normal. No one had film. No one had anything to show me. That evening, I tried to recreate something reasonable. I sat on the porch and left the cabin lights off. Rosie lay at my feet, and the water kept its low, regular sound. I watched the horizon, watched the hilltops. At 2:50, the ferry horn sounded 3 times, the ordinary call and response, and then everything went still. Nothing brightened, nothing hummed through the air. Whatever had been earlier didn't arrive again. Over the next few days, other small things turned up. A length of fishing net on the beach, draped in a perfect semicircle as if someone had folded it there and walked away. A patch of my lawn by the shed where the grass was slightly warmer to the touch at dawn, though I'd left sprinklers off. Electronics acted like someone had tapped the house. My router reset for no reason at 2 in the morning one night. The little LED blinking back to life with a timestamp 2 minutes different from the wall clock. Each item alone I'd accept. A router glitch, a kid's prank, the creak of old wood. Together, they nested into that morning's blue like birds finding the same tree. I'm not the kind of person who makes a big deal of being unsettled. I've got a mortgage and a job, and I fix things with superglue and duct tape. I don't look for mysteries. But the way that light filled the room, color without intensity, presence without noise, felt deliberate, as if something had wanted to be noticed just enough to wake someone, then gone without leaving a scrap. I told myself to stop watching the clock at night. I tried not to listen for a hum. For a week, I kept the blinds up and the porch light on like a bad security measure. Rosie seemed fine most days, but she would sometimes stand at the window and stare down past the cove, ears perked. Once she whimpered quietly and wouldn't move until the gulls started. I began to wake up some nights and check the room, and each time find it ordinary. On Wednesday morning, a woman from town came by asking if I'd seen anyone out on the rocks at 3 in the morning. She and her husband walked a lot, and she was careful with language. She said she thought she saw a silhouette against the blue and that it felt colder where she'd stood for a second. Her husband had smelled something the way Tom described. Ozone. Pennies. She showed me a photo she'd snapped on her way home from a late shift. The sky in it had a sliver of color raw and blue and then was gone in the next picture. It looks like someone was drawing with light, she said, but no one was there. I don't have a tidy ending. No official report came back that explained anything. No government notices, no utility company statements, no weather anomaly. The town bulletin had 3 messages about errant GPS readings around that time and a ferry report of a short VHF interference. The harbor log had an odd entry. Unidentified light observed, duration 7 minutes, no contact. They wrote it like a fact and left it at that. A few nights later, I woke to Rosie pawing my hand. It was daylight, strange and early. She had mud on her paws, but looked at me like she wanted to go out. I pulled the blinds and there was nothing, just the gray morning and the harbor boats yawing with the tide. No blue, no scent. The one thing that stuck was that metallic smell, which I could still summon in memory like conjuring a snowball. Sharp, clean, and impossible to hold. I kept thinking of the blue washing across the ceiling, the way it didn't so much illuminate as settle into the room like a second, cooler air. It didn't make sense. It didn't fit anything I could name. I went back to my routines as best I could. I checked on the harbor log every week. I asked around at the bait shop and at the post office. People shrug, but a few of them would meet my eye like they expected me not to stop asking. No one got a picture that kept. No one could point me to a cause. We've all moved on to normal things. Fixing a gate, a kid's baseball game, someone needing help with a flat tire. Still, sometimes at night, when the wind sounds like a distant freight and the house is just about asleep, I stand in the doorway and look out toward the black water. I wait for that tiny pulse of ozone to wake my nose. Mostly it doesn't come. Mostly it's ordinary. But when the moon hits the cove just right, there's a moment the water lightens and the house feels like it might be warm on the inside and cold on the outside. For a second, I can almost see that pale light again, held like glass over the roof. And I wonder whether it ever was a light at all, or something else, choosing to be a color I didn't have a name for. We were already quiet when Jesse pointed up. It was late, somewhere past 11, and the fire had burned down to a ring of angry embers. We'd been on the ridge for 2 nights, just the 2 of us and my old Subaru, 2 sleeping bags, and a cooler of things we promised would be simpler than city life. The sky was absurdly clear, the kind of clarity you only get when there's no light for miles. I remember thinking, before anything else happened, that you could see the backbone of the world laid out in stars. Jessie didn't whisper. He just nodded up, and her hand found the brim of her headlamp like a reflex. "Look," she said. I followed her finger. There, above the line of pines on the far ridge, a cluster of small lights drifted slowly in formation. Not blinking like aircraft, not red and green. They were soft, steady points, maybe a dozen, moving together as if tied to the same invisible string. They wheeled a fraction, then glided in a slow arc, keeping the same spacing. It looked choreographed. It looked wrong. At first we thought it was a light show from a distant concert or some hunters with lanterns, but this was higher than that, or at least it seemed to be above the trees instead of at a treetop level, and it didn't make any sound. That's the thing that got under my skin. The silence. Even the ridge's usual night noise, an owl calling, a radio far below on the road, seemed to back away from that patch of sky. We sat on our knees in the cold and watched. Jesse muttered something about drones, and I said drones would usually blink a little, would buzz if they were close. Neither of us could see motion in any conventional sense. No change in altitude, no staggering moves, just a slow, harmonious glide. They moved like a small school of fish above the pines. We tried the bits of rationality that keep you steady. Photographs, video. My phone was dead on battery. I'd forgotten a charger. Jessie handed me her compact camera, and I fumbled because my fingers were numb. The camera behaved like a camera until it didn't. The screen stuttered, then showed the lens view like normal, and when I pointed it up, the viewfinder rendered the lights as nothing but a faint wash, like the camera's sensor had decided the contrast was too much. I snapped a photo anyway. The shutter clicked like a polite animal, but when I checked the image, it was only black where the cluster should have been. That felt small at the time, a fluke. Then the wind died down. The whole ridge went still. Even the embers seemed to hold their breath. And then, I don't know why I did it, I picked up my headlamp and switched it to high beam and pointed it up toward the lights. More to test the world than to test the lights. All of the lights went out at once. It wasn't a dimming or a fade. You could have counted the fractions of a second. One moment they were there, warm and moving in formation. The next, they were simply gone, like someone had struck a match and let the flame drop. The night that had been so full of stars felt suddenly much larger, the blackness pressing further out than before. For a second, I thought we'd timed a cloud right in front of them, but the stars behind the ridge were still sharp. There was no cloud. Jessie swore softly. "No way," she said. Her voice had that raw edge people get when surprise goes into fear. I turned my headlamp off because I realized how stupid it would look to stand there with a spotlight after something like that. We sat and listened, and the only thing we heard was our breathing and the small tick of the cooling fire. Before then, though, there had been other small off things, the kind of things you might have chalked up to being tired or to being out of cell range, except they stacked up. On the drive up the mountain, the GPS had lost the route for a while, the voice giving me stubborn, useless directions to places that didn't exist. The ranger station's bulletin board had a note about unusual radio static that residents had reported around midnight near the ridge. But the ranger who posted it shrugged and said it was probably wind hitting old poles. When we hiked the loop that afternoon, a doe had followed our path for a long stretch. She didn't spook when we broke trail. She just trotted beside us as if she expected to catch up to someone. Back at camp that evening, the cheap solar lantern we'd hung on a low branch started cycling on and off despite being fully charged. It flicked like an old projector all through dinner, and then steadied. Jessie commented that it felt like the sky was watching us back, and I laughed because being a little spooked in the dark was what the trip was about. Later, when I put my hand on my phone to check the time, the lock screen showed 3:08 a.m., though my watch, which I'd not fussed with in months, read 11:02 p.m. I reset the phone and blamed a background update. It didn't help that when we tried to get reception, the bars were a stubborn, useless emptiness. After those lights went out, nothing dramatic happened. That was the worst part. No chase, no thunderclap, no obvious explanation. We debated hiking up the ridge to look, but the trees were steep, and the only light we had were headlamps with dying batteries and a fire that wouldn't last forever. The sensible thing would have been to pack up and drive down to the ranger station and ask the guy about it. We agreed to wait a few minutes, give the world a chance to put itself back together the way it does when you want it to. We sat there in a hush, and that was when the other oddities got more insistent. The camp's shadows grew long within themselves. The bob of embers threw a darkness beneath each log that didn't match the light. Conversation felt clumsy and then more urgent. Sentences bumped like people trying to recall a lost name. Jessie said she felt watched, which sounded like a joke but was too earnest to laugh off. We both looked around, to the tree line, to the highway's faint glow far below, to the place in the sky where the lights had been. There was nothing to see but ordinary stars and that cold, patient black. I tried recording my voice on the camera's audio just so I would remember how it felt to be there. The file showed up later with a thin second of white noise right in the middle where we'd been talking, and when I replayed it at home, the conversation around that point had been chopped like a sentence cut with scissors. It was nothing conclusive, but the notch irritated me. People say your instruments lie sometimes. Instruments don't usually lie all at once in the same spot. We kept glancing up anyway, like people who hadn't learned the rhythm of being watched yet. After 10 minutes, the wind picked up and the pines began to whisper. Somewhere down the slope, a coyote called, short and rough, a sound that belonged in the world and made you think of survival. We were starting to relax back into the normal pattern of camping. Check the fire, refill the coffee, shrug off shadowed thoughts when they came. I told Jessie we were overreacting. She didn't argue. An hour later, when the embers were thin and we'd mostly stopped talking, The sky did something else small that should, in hindsight, have been a clue. We saw a faint band of light sweep over the field where the irrigation circles used to be. Not much, just a hint of glow moving at the treetop level. It wasn't visible from the road below because there was no source there. It was like watching a hand move across the night at a distance, so subtle it felt like a trick of peripheral vision. Then it was gone. We slept, but not well. I woke once in the small hours, and it was empty and cold enough that my breath fogged the inside of the sleeping bag. I lay listening to the night. An occasional car far on the road, a bird in the distance, and nothing else, as if whatever had been in the sky decided that was enough and let the world go on. Morning didn't feel like an explanation. The ridge was ordinary in daylight. The trees had the usual scatter of recent chipmunk runs, the ground a trompe of small prints. The one clear remnant of the night was the little patch of snow we found on the lee side of a rock, higher than it should have been for the temperatures. It looked like someone had placed a coin there and left the rest of the world alone. We drove down later and told a ranger at the station what we'd seen. He listened without surprise, asked what time, where exactly on the ridge, if we'd been drinking. After we told him, he asked the same questions everyone asks: battery levels, devices used, if anyone else had seen it. He made a log entry on a torn pad and told us to call if we remembered anything else. He didn't read from a list. He scratched something down and shrugged. People see things up here, he said. Sometimes it's military, sometimes some testing, sometimes just tricks of the weather. Driving home, the world was the same as it had been on the way up. The highway ran like a river. Dogs barked in yards, kids left for school in the morning light, and everything tried to make the night into a story you could put under the lid of your daily life. Jesse and I kept catching each other's eyes in the rear view, like kids who share a secret that's too big for the space between them. I've thought about that ridge a dozen ways since. I've tried to pin it to test flights, to hunters, to the way light refracts over cold air. None of them fit all the small pieces. The formation movement, the total simultaneous out, the electrical oddities, the way the night went quiet, like someone had muted it. The house camera we installed when I got home recorded nothing from that night beyond a gap where the memory card had stuttered, a single bad sector. The image file was corrupt where the notch had been. We did make it home. We both went back to work on Monday, and life reassembled itself in the practical ways it always does. But I keep catching my reflection in a window at midnight and looking up at the dark like someone waiting to see choreography where once there had been a cluster of lights. I imagine the ridge the way you imagine any place that held a thing you can't name, both ordinary and a little off, like a clock that adds a second when no one's looking. The doubt lives in the details: the dead camera, the notched audio, the snow on the rock. And when the days are ordinary and long, it feels like maybe that was all it ever was. But when the night is very clear, and the world is quiet enough that you can hear your own breath, I think about the way those lights move together and what it would mean for something to be patient enough to wait until someone shone a light at it, and then, with perfect timing, simply go out. I took Gus out because he started whining at the bedroom door about 3 a.m, the kind of persistent, annoyed whine that means business. The house was the same as always. One story, a sagging porch light, the faint glow from the neighbor's living room across the yard. It had been a hot week and the nights were still thick. The air felt like someone had left a damp blanket over the street. I fumbled for my slippers, clipped on his leash, and went outside without turning on any lights because I didn't want to wake the house up more than it already was. The moment I stepped off the porch, the sound hit me, low, slow, and so regular that for an instant I thought it was part of the house settling, that familiar creak you get after the AC kicks off. I walked to the back of the yard and paused because the sound didn't belong to the house. It came from above, like something breathing very, very deep in the sky. Not a gust of wind, not a truck idling far away. A steady inhale-exhale that rolled across the back fence and under the old maple tree. Gus stopped tugging and planted his paws, ears forward. He looked up the way you look up at a storm on the horizon if you're trying to guess where it will break. His tail went still. He didn't bark. The sound wasn't loud. If anything, it felt too big for the night and too distant to be right there with us. But it had a presence that made the hairs along my forearms rise. I listened for the ordinary things that would explain it. Airplane? No. Planes make a turbine whine and move. This breathed. A generator? The hum from the neighbor's shed was a steady mechanical noise I knew by heart. This had a shape. In, out, slow and patient. I put my hand flat on Gus's back and realized my pulse had synchronized with that exhale without meaning to. That did not help. I live in a small subdivision out by the river. It's the sort of place where people leave chairs on porches and wave as they pass. Usually at night you hear crickets and the occasional car. This night the crickets were muted, like someone had turned down a track. The neighbor's radio, usually a low buzz on his back deck, cut out. The street light on the corner blinked twice and stayed on, bright as a watch face. I made the mistake of looking at it in the silence and felt the world narrow. Everything seemed held a little too still. I went to the top of the porch steps so I could see more of the sky and squinted up between telephone wires. Nothing obvious. No moving lights, no flare of a helicopter. The stars were muted by humidity. The sound kept breathing. It made me aware of the small things around me. The way the maple's leaves didn't rattle, the way the trash can lids down the block were unnaturally still. Gus whined again and leaned into my leg. Eventually, I went to the street to see if anyone else was out. Mrs. Garza next door had her blinds cracked, one light on in the living room. I waved and she shuffled out onto her stoop with a cup of coffee and that look people get when they're trying to decide whether to be afraid. When I asked if she heard anything, she said, "Like a faraway wail?" in a voice like she was testing the words. That made me laugh, partly because the comparison was ridiculous and partly because it was the best description I'd heard, a big, slow breath that didn't belong to anything I knew. We stood in the faint porch light and listened. The breathing rolled past us again, and Mrs. Garza pointed toward the field across from her house, where the highway eased into the bend. "It's out that way," she said. "I thought it was a storm, but there's no wind." She told me she'd heard it once before last month, briefly, and then it stopped. "No one I called believed me," she said. "You're the first one who came out." Across the street, two boys were on bikes with phones out, recording. I could see the small white screens punch through the fog like fireflies. They had a kind of excited terror, the look teenagers get when something breaks their expectation of a safe night. "It sounds like breathing," one of them said into the camera like he'd been given the line. He held the phone up to me and asked if I wanted to listen. The recording, when I heard it later, had a low bass wobble that made my chest move, but it was thin through the device. The reality of it in person felt much more stubborn. I walked my loop around the block while Gus sniffed the gutters as if they might contain an answer. The sound didn't change pitch or pace, it simply moved. Or perhaps we moved with it, like a tide. When I crossed the small wooden bridge over the creek, the sound seemed to lay itself over the surface of the water, and I could see tiny ripples arrange themselves in silent symmetry. A heron flew low and then stalled mid-air in a way that made my stomach lurch. It did not call, it did not flap hard, it just adjusted and then continued on as if a metronome had told it how. About 20 minutes into the noise, my phone started to act weird. The compass app spun for a while and then showed me the direction to nowhere. My flashlight mode sputtered bright and dim a couple of times, though the battery was full. I texted my sister a quick, half-joking, "You up? You hear something?" because telling someone else made it feel less like I was losing my grip. She didn't reply right away, and I realized later she'd seen nothing from her place in the city. She told me the next day her phone had been fine. The oddities were local. Back at the house, I found other little things. The porch motion sensor, one of those cheap stick-on jobs, had a log entry for 2:43 a.m. showing motion detected, but the camera recorded only a white frame for that time. I stood on the porch and watched the tree line and tried to reconcile the footage with my own sense of time. It's embarrassing to say you keep an eye on a motion sensor, but when your night gets bent sideways, you start trusting gadgets because they're rational. Except that night, they weren't. The sensor's log said the thing had been there while my own body remembered being still and listening. At one point, I walked out into the field opposite the houses, short grass, a slope into the highway ditch, and I believed briefly that if I got away from the built world, I might get a clearer sense of what it was. The breath in the sky was fuller there, as if proximity mattered. Birds settled in the hedgerow with a synchronized rustle that made me think of curtains closing. A fox crossed below me and paused on a knoll like an audience member. The air tasted faintly metallic, not sharp, but present, a copper tang that made my teeth feel odd. I thought about calling the police because it felt increasingly like an event that could be dangerous if misinterpreted, an aircraft in trouble, some impaired giant machine. I dialed, then didn't. The voice on the line told me when I finally asked that they'd had panicked calls from 2 neighborhoods over about a deep hum, but nothing official. If it's an aircraft, the operator said, "We'll get a notice. Usually there's an alert." There wasn't. The county scanner on the volunteer firehouse came back clear. No distress calls, no emergency equipment out on the highway. That made me wonder if whatever it was chose not to show up on the things we use to prove things. Around 3:30, the sound shifted a fraction, not in rhythm or in volume, but in its relationship to us. The inhalations seemed longer and the exhalations gentler, like something rimmed the sky and laid its chest over the neighborhood. We went quiet in the way you go quiet when you're listening to someone else's secret. Gus leaned against my leg and made a small sound. He was nervous but not frantic, like he was bracing for something. From my kitchen window, I watched one of the street lamps flicker in slow beats, not quite in sync, like someone might be fidgeting with the switch. The next street over, a pair of headlights swept down the road and slowed. The driver sat motionless, windows fogged, watching the sky the way you watch slow traffic. 2 blocks away, Mr. Patel stood in his pajamas on the steps with a blanket and a flashlight. No one had moved in a way that said panic. People were out and watching, like a town looking up for a meteor that's part of a larger, quieter script. Then, very suddenly, the breath stopped. I mean stopped, the inhale didn't complete, the exhale didn't fade. One moment the sky had that low rhythm, and the next minute there was this looseness in my chest where the sound had been. The crickets came back with a sharpness as if too loud after that silence. Dogs barked and then were quiet. Someone laughed nervously a ways down the block. My phone vibrated with messages from neighbors. "You hear that? Yeah. WTF." The logs on a few of the cheap cameras showed the same white frame at the moment it stopped, like the devices had blinked and missed it. What stayed with me was the absence. A presence that big leaves a hollow in ordinary noise. The air tasted like anything after an electrical storm, clean but with that ghost of copper, and then it faded. I led Gus back inside, and he seemed to take a long step into normalcy, as if re-entering the house fixed him. I sat at the kitchen table and tried to write down times and details while they were fresh, because memory is a sieve, and small things slip out first. I made notes that night about the compass, the motion sensor, the fox, the crickets dropping out. I wrote down the time the breathing stopped, and the little things people had stood in their doorways to report. I tried to find a pattern and found only the shape of people who had stepped outside in the middle of the night and listened. In the morning, the sky was the color of empty glass, and the neighbors went about their routines like nothing had happened. Someone put a lawn chair back on the porch. Kids rode bicycles. The volunteer firefighters posted a message online saying they hadn't found anything that would explain calls about a hum. The motion sensor logs stayed odd for the cameras that had them. White frames, little gaps in the footage, like a recorded wink. I told my sister about it later that day over coffee. She nodded and said, "Weird." And then we both started offering mundane explanations. Thunder from a distant storm, a pipeline machine, someone testing equipment. They were reasonable things to say because most nights have reasonable answers. Mine felt like something that stepped into the neighborhood long enough to let us notice it, and then step back out without asking anyone's permission. I still take Gus out at odd hours sometimes, mostly because he likes the extra sniffing time, and sometimes because I can't shake the feeling that the world might cough again in the night. I watch the sky on those walks and listen harder than I used to. because listening is one of the few things you can do that matters then. Mostly there's only the dog's breath and the neighbor's refrigerator and the slow hourly traffic of life. Every now and then, when the wind is wrong and the air tastes of copper, I stop and hold my hand to my chest to see if my pulse will suddenly match a sound I don't expect. And I wonder, without wanting to know too much, what it was like to hear the sky breathing above the houses. I woke up sometime after 2 in the morning, probably around the time my dog, Benny, usually shifted in his bed. At first, I thought it was him moving, but then I noticed the sound, a low, constant hum coming from outside. Not like an engine or a neighbor's generator. It had this smooth, steady pitch, like a tone you'd hear in a sound bath, but darker. The kind that presses against your chest without making a single vibration you can feel. I sat up in bed and squinted at the window. My blinds were half closed, but I could make out something on the lawn. It wasn't quite bright, more like a faint glow hovering just above the grass. The shape of it was perfect, a circle maybe 6 or 7 feet across. Frost had formed on it, but only inside the circle, sparkling faintly blue. The rest of the lawn was completely normal. I rubbed my eyes and blinked, thinking it might be some reflection, or maybe streetlight bouncing off ice in a weird way. It stayed there, humming softly. Benny started growling low in his throat, his fur bristling. He usually didn't do that unless there was someone on the property, but I didn't see anyone. I slowly pulled on my slippers and padded over to the window, careful not to make a sound. The closer I got, the more it felt wrong. Not cold wrong, not dangerous wrong, just impossible wrong. I grabbed my phone to use the flashlight, but the screen flickered, then died. I looked at the battery, full when I'd gone to bed. I tried turning it on again, same thing. In the back of my mind, I noticed that the humming seemed to synchronize with my heartbeat. It wasn't a normal rhythm. It accelerated when I moved, slowed when I stopped. My stomach knotted. After a minute or two, I did what I probably shouldn't have. I stepped outside. The air was crisp, almost biting. I kept Benny close, his leash tight in my hand. The frost circle was exactly the same up close. Perfectly round, the edges crisp and glowing that faint, unnatural blue. The grass inside it was brittle, frosty, and colder than it should have been, but the ground around it was fine. The more I looked at it, the more I realized the circle wasn't melting at all. The frost stayed, even though the lawn had a thin layer of dew that would normally start evaporating in the cold air. I crouched down and ran my fingers just above it. The frost didn't crumble under me, didn't feel wet or rough. It was just suspended, like it was frozen in a thin layer that didn't quite touch the ground. Benny whimpered and tugged at the leash, and the sound of his nails against the grass seemed absurdly loud. Then I noticed movement at the edges of my vision. Nothing I could focus on directly, but something flickering, faint and blue, like the edges of the circle were shifting just slightly. Every time I turned my head, it vanished. I stepped back, and the circle seemed to shrink slightly, almost imperceptibly, as if it was responding to me. I decided to go back inside, telling myself it was frost forming in a weird pattern, that the glow was a reflection or my brain making things up. But when I turned toward the house, I stopped. The hum got louder, almost urgent, and Benny froze. The streetlights didn't reach the edge of the lawn, and the fog that had rolled in was thin but heavy enough to blur shapes. There was a darker shadow hovering just above the grass on the opposite side of the circle. Not a person, not a tree, just a shape. I didn't move. My hand tightened on the leash. The shadow shifted slightly, pulsing with the blue glow from the frost. Then the humming changed pitch, going higher for a few seconds, then dropping lower. It was deliberate, like someone or something was modulating it. I stepped back, almost tripping over a garden hose. The frost circle didn't change, but I could swear the edges rippled slightly, like it was breathing. I tried calling Benny to me, but my voice sounded tinny, distant. He barked once, sharp, and the shadow flickered again, then vanished. I ran inside and locked the door, keeping Benny close. The hum faded over a few seconds. I grabbed a coat and a flashlight, thinking I'd go outside again, but when I looked out the window, the frost circle was gone. The lawn was normal, wet with dew, no trace of frost. My heart was racing so badly I could feel it in my throat. The next morning, the air had warmed a little, and the frost that usually clung to the grass was gone entirely. I checked the lawn carefully. Nothing. No mark, no ring, no sign anything unusual had been there. I called Caleb later, my neighbor who always joked about alien sightings, and told him. He paused, then said he hadn't seen anything, but he'd heard his dog whining outside the night before and some strange humming. Since then, little things have been off. My phone battery drains way faster than it should, especially overnight. Lights flicker in odd patterns, usually near windows facing the lawn. Benny stares at the yard sometimes, growling low, for no reason. And on clear nights, I can almost hear it again. That low hum, just at the edge of hearing, like it's waiting. I've checked the frost circle spot every day since. Nothing. Grass is fine, soil is normal, no frost forming, no residue. But sometimes when I'm inside and it's completely quiet, I swear I can faint blue glow along the edge of the lawn, just at the periphery of my vision. I turn to look, and it's gone. I keep telling myself it's nothing. Frost, fog, imagination. But Benny hasn't stopped growling at it, and I know he wouldn't. I don't want to go out there at night again, not really, but a part of me knows I'll have to eventually, just to see if it comes back. Until then, I watch from the window, the hum faintly echoing in my chest, and I try not to blink. It started on a Thursday night in late October. I'd stayed late at my friend Caleb's house in Kingston, helping him move a busted sofa down into his basement. We cracked open a few beers after, and by the time I checked my phone, it was almost midnight. His place sat at the far end of town, right where the last stretch of road narrowed into a wooded path that eventually met up with mine. About a 20-minute walk if you can cut through the trees. I'd done it 100 times before. The air had that damp, cold feeling that sits just above freezing, and the sky was clouded enough that the moonlight came and went. There was nobody out, no cars, no porch lights, just the steady hum of wind through the pines. I zipped my jacket and started down the dirt path. About halfway through, I saw something pale out of the corner of my eye. I thought it was maybe a flashlight, the kind of faint glow you get when someone's walking parallel to you a ways off. I turned, expecting to see another person, but the woods were empty. The light disappeared the instant I faced it. At first, I told myself it was just my eyes adjusting. When you stare at your phone too long and then walk into darkness, your vision can play tricks. But a few minutes later, it came back. Same position. Off to my left, behind the trees. A soft, steady glow, maybe 10 or 15 feet off the ground. Not bright enough to light anything up, just there. I slowed my pace and looked again. Nothing, just the faint outlines of trunks and branches. Took a few more steps, and the glow reappeared, this time behind me. I could see it reflected faintly in the puddles along the trail. I spun around fast enough that I half expected to catch someone. Again, gone. It kept happening like that every minute or so. Always just at the edge of my vision. Always gone when I tried to face it. Not flashing, not moving wildly, just following. It was too soft and steady to be headlights, and there wasn't a road anywhere near the section I was on. When I finally stopped walking and just listened, the forest was quiet, not silent, but wrong. The crickets and night insects that usually filled the air had gone still. I stood there with my breath fogging in front of me, trying to hear anything. A branch cracking, a footstep, even a bird. Nothing. The glow came back again, this time faintly through the mist that hung low between the trees. I stared at it without turning my head, using my peripheral vision because that seemed to be the only way to see it clearly. The more I focused, the more I realized it wasn't a single light. It was several, maybe 3 or 4 points close together, shifting slightly like they were suspended on something moving in place. I took a step toward it, just one. The lights dimmed instantly, like someone turned down a dimmer switch, and then they were gone again. I pulled out my phone to use the flashlight. The screen stayed black for a second longer than usual before coming on, which made my stomach drop. The flashlight beam stretched maybe 10 feet ahead and caught nothing but tree trunks and the thin fog curling between them. When I swung it back behind me, I saw a patch of disturbed leaves across the trail. A circular area where the ground looked scuffed, as if something heavy had been resting there. That was the first time I felt real fear. My mind was still trying to land on something logical. Kids messing around, a hunter with a drone, even swamp gas, but every thought felt flimsy. The air smelled sharp, metallic, like rain on old batteries. I started walking faster, checking over my shoulder every few seconds. The glow came back once more, now off to my right. I didn't turn this time. I just watched it slide slowly between the trees as I walked, like it was keeping pace. When I stopped, it stopped. The trees opened up ahead where the trail crossed a small clearing with a power line running through. I could see the faint orange glow of a streetlight half a mile down the hill. Home. I took a breath and stepped into the clearing. For a few seconds, I felt stupid for being scared. The open space and the sound of the wind through the lines made it feel normal again. Then, from behind me, the glow flickered on, stronger this time. It wasn't white, more of a pale, washed-out green. I didn't turn. I just kept walking, pretending not to notice. The sound that followed wasn't loud, but it cut straight through everything else, a low hum that rose and fell in slow, uneven waves, like a power transformer about to die. It wasn't mechanical, though. It had this texture to it, like it was breathing. The hum matched the rhythm of my steps for a few seconds before it changed pitch and got deeper. My chest vibrated. I stopped dead in the middle of the clearing. The glow grew brighter against the trees behind me, outlining their branches in a way that didn't make sense. The shadows bent wrong, curling toward the light instead of away from it. Then it went dark again, all at once. The hum cut out too. My ears rang with the sudden quiet. I didn't wait. I sprinted down the path until I hit the asphalt of the main road. My legs were shaking so badly I had to stop by the guardrail just to catch my breath. The whole world felt normal again. Distant highway noise, the smell of wet leaves, my own heartbeat in my ears. When I looked back, the tree line was black. Nothing followed. I made it home in maybe 5 minutes, locked the door behind me, and went straight to the kitchen window that faced the woods. The trail was barely visible from there, but I could see a faint patch of fog hovering above the trees. I kept watching, waiting for the glow to come back. It didn't. When I took Winston, my dog, out the next morning, he stopped dead at the edge of the yard and refused to go near the trail. His fur stood up and he made this low whining sound I'd never heard before. I pulled gently on his leash, but he planted his feet and stared into the trees. Later that day, I went back to the clearing to prove to myself it was nothing. The ground was damp from dew, and in the dirt near the power line tower was a pattern. Not footprints exactly, but impressions, like something had pressed down on the earth evenly in a circular shape, about 6 feet across. I bent down and ran my hand over the marks. The soil there was warm. That night, I told Caleb. He laughed at first, thought I was joking, until I mentioned the hum. Then his expression changed. He said he'd heard something similar 2 weeks earlier, around the same time at night, a deep, slow pulse that made his windows vibrate. He'd assumed it was a plane flying low. I didn't tell anyone else, but I started noticing small things after that. Porch light bulbs dying faster than they should, my car radio cutting out for a second near the woods, my phone camera refusing to focus when I aimed it toward the tree line. A few nights later, around midnight again, I stepped outside with Winston. The air was still, no wind at all. I stood by the porch rail and stared toward the dark stretch of woods. For a while, nothing happened. Then, right at the edge of my vision, I caught a flicker of pale green light. Faint, soft, moving between the trees. I didn't turn. I just kept staring straight ahead, pretending to look at the sky. The glow drifted along the tree line for a few seconds before fading out. The silence that followed was thick enough to make my stomach knot. I waited a few minutes, holding my breath, then went back inside. That was about 3 weeks ago. The trail's still there, and during the day, it's as ordinary as ever. But sometimes at night, when the house gets quiet and the wind dies down, I catch a faint reflection on the kitchen window, a soft glow somewhere behind me, talike, just at the edge of the glass, and when I turn to look, there's nothing there. I had the drone up over the field when the feed went to static. I wasn't doing anything dramatic, just a quick sweep to check the fence line and the irrigation wheel before the next day's shift. The farm's been mine for 3 years, out past the county road, where the sky sits wide and flat, and I like to fly the drone at dusk, because you can see the lines better against the evening. I parked my truck on the track, engine idling, windows down a crack. Gus, my blue heeler, lay on the tailgate and watched the little screen on my controller like he understood it meant me being away from the house for even longer. The drone had been behaving like a drone, smooth, a little buzzy, obedient to the stick movements. I was about 200 feet up, maybe 70 yards out from where I was sitting, pointing the camera down the middle of the field. The feed showed the furrows, the fence posts, one lone rusted irrigation wheel near the east end. I panned left toward the tree line, and then the screen went fuzz, like somebody had dragged a thumb across it, and then nothing but a blocky gray hiss. At first I thought it was interference. Phone calls drop out here sometimes, and that stretch of highway can get a cell tower hiccup. I fiddled with the antenna, nudged the transmitter, and cursed at the screen like a man trying to wake a sleeping kid. The controller's telemetry still showed the drone's altitude and battery, everything nominal, but the video was gone. I hit record out of habit because even a bad feed can sometimes salvage a frame or two when it reconnects. The time on the controller read 8:11 p.m. The drone hovered, motors steady. The field was quiet enough, a few frogs near the temporary pond, a long, low sound from the highway in the distance, and the soft cotton of the clouds rolling in. I told myself to relax, that it was probably a temporary glitch. The farm tech I'd talked to in town had said those cheap channels get noisy at night. When the picture finally came back, the color balance was wrong, flat and cold, as if someone had dialed the saturation down. My stomach tightened, because at first glance there was nothing strange in the frame. The furrows, the irrigation wheel, the fence line, the slight dark shape of my tractor half buried in the tall grass. Then the camera tilted, and right there, centered in the frame, was a silhouette standing in the middle of the field. It was a black shape against the paler ground, the right height for a man. It looked like someone staring up at the drone, which made sense in a grain of salt, common sense way. What didn't make sense was the position. That black shape was standing maybe 10 feet from the east fence post, which was at least 100 feet closer to me than the truck where I was actually sitting. I glanced at my tailgate reflexively. I was practically in the driver's seat. Gus lifted his head and cocked it like he was hearing a high-pitched note. I leaned forward and zoomed in on the feed. The silhouette didn't have any features, only a simple outline. Head, shoulders, arms hanging. It wasn't waving, didn't move. The drone's map overlay, burned in the corner, showed the craft hovering in the same GPS spot I'd left it, and my little blue dot, the controller's idea of where I was, showed me sitting in my truck exactly where I had been. I tapped the return to home button more out of muscle memory than anything. The drone beeped acknowledgement but didn't move. I told myself to take it serious and not panic. I killed the engine with a finger because an idling truck felt foolish when all that was going on. Gus whined like he wanted me to do something he'd recognize. I set the controller down on my knees and stood up, stretching, because standing felt like the right thing to do before I walked back into the field. The moon was behind a bank of clouds and the light was thin and blue. The silhouette in my feed stayed where it was, utterly still. I walked the path toward the fence. The controller pinged me occasionally. Telemetry, battery checks. The drone's altitude read 210 feet. My walk wasn't fast. I didn't want to alarm anything. I kept scanning the ground as I went, thinking the silhouette would be a person, maybe a neighbor out late, a hitchhiker, somebody checking the boundary. I got to the east fence post and there was no one. There's a small low ridge that runs there. You can see it from the track, but you have to be right on it to get the angle. I stood on it and looked back toward the field, toward the drone. All I could see was a rent of lighter ground where the grass lay compressed in a patch the size of a coffee table. The grass wasn't burned or trampled like a person had paced through it. It was only settled, crushed in a perfect oval. My phone buzzed in my chest. A text from Marco, the kid who works the next farm over. "You still out?" it read. I typed back "now" and left the message sent but didn't hit the send button. I had to check the feed. I lifted the controller and the silhouette was still there, and only then did I realize the timestamp on the video had jumped. The controller clock read 8:11 when the feed cut. On the screen now, the recording time showed 8:24 p.m., a full 13 minutes since the glitch. But I'd been walking for maybe 2 minutes. The horizon had a different slant to it. The clouds looked slightly farther along. Something about that time shift felt like a slap you couldn't hear. I kept talking to myself, checked the GPS on the controller. It matched the drone. I looked at the map overlay that gave the drone's coordinates. And then I looked at my phone's GPS, and the little blue dot was where the truck had been in the track, exactly 200 feet away. The silhouette remained, inert, like someone had left a shadow there and walked away. I took another few steps closer to where the video showed the figure standing. My boots pressed into the soft ground, and I noticed then that the compressed oval of grass made no imprint where someone would have stood. No scuff marks, no footprints, nothing to tell me anything had been there at all. The air smelled faintly of ozone, like after lightning but without thunder. My scalp prickled. For a second, my mind toyed with rationalities. Night vision or heat signature. No, the silhouette was flat black, not thermal. A trick of the camera? Maybe. But why would a camera trick only at that one spot? Why would the drone's timestamp jump forward? Why did the video resume with a static hiss and a single perfect outline in the frame centered as if placed? I climbed back into the truck, half cursing, and set the controller down. The feed remained live, and I watched the silhouette even as I sipped cold coffee. The image was too crisp, too deliberate. I panned the drone slowly. The silhouette didn't change location. When I tried to zoom and focus, the controller stuttered, and then the screen skidded into a bar of white for a heartbeat, and then showed the silhouette again. But now it seemed a hair taller, though that could have been the zoom. Gus, who'd been growling softly in his sleep on the tailgate, sat up and put his paws on my knees. His eyes were fixed where the feed showed the figure. He whined and slipped off the tailgate to circle the back of the truck as if finally realizing something was outside that I couldn't see. By the time my neighbor Marco pulled up, he'd come because everyone knows you don't leave a farmer with a weird feed alone. It was 8:33. He asked me what I was doing, and I pointed at the screen. He watched for maybe 10 seconds and didn't say anything. He squinted, made the fishing line face he does when a problem needs a solution, and asked if the drone could be broadcasting something. I told him it was a simple model. It didn't do overlays like that. Together, we walked over to the patch again. We peered down at the flattened grass. Marco knelt and pushed at the soil. Nothing. He said, "Weird," once, and as if to prove it, his phone chimed with a notification. A news alert from the small county app. Power disruptions reported. Residents advised to report unusual activity. Someone else had seen something, or at least blamed the grid. He tossed his phone to me like a hot potato. We tried to call it back to the home point. The drone reached for us like a lost thing and then started to descend. The controller beeped and the map showed a new track. The drone dropping in a slow spiral toward the oval where the silhouette had been. I felt my throat tighten. My thumb hovered over the pause land buttons. When the video feed cleared, the frame showed a view of the ground. No person, no figure. The drone's shadow passed over the pale oval, and the grass lifted and settled in its wake, no different than any other. We walked the field until the drone landed, and then I took the controller and played the footage back. The file recorded the static, and then the clear silhouette, and then 13 minutes forward. There was a single extra frame at 8:24:12, a grainy blur where, for a split second, there was the impression of legs, like someone had moved, but that frame was only a smudge. A file repair utility later said nothing could be recovered beyond that. Marco tried to joke to break the tension, but his laugh was thin. He stayed until the truck's heater had warmed my hands and his coffee was gone. He said he didn't like being out here alone and left me with a pat on the shoulder that felt less like neighborly reassurance and more like a dismissal. I packed the drone into its case, even though the battery still had 27%, and slid into the driver's seat. Gus thumped his tail against the cab like a snore. On the drive back toward the house, the headlights picked out deer in a distant hedge, eyes like spilled coins. The county app pinged again, a terse notice about multiple reports of unusual visual phenomena, no verified threats identified. The local volunteer fire page had one line of chatter about cameras glitching and strange silhouettes, and that was as official as it got. At the end of the night, when the coffee had cooled and the barn cats had claimed their laps, I watched the footage again on the laptop and tried to scrubbing through the frames to make it something I could solve. The silhouette was still there in the middle of the field, exact as before. The clock in the footage read 8:24, and my truck's dash still said 8:11. The metadata on the file listed creation times that didn't make sense, and recovery software kept truncating the same section, like something deliberately kept half hidden. I told myself a dozen plausible things: drone firmware glitch, GPS leap, compression artifact, sleep deprivation, a prank caught in a bad angle. But in the kitchen, with the soft hiss of the refrigerator and the cat's indifferent rumble, none of those things sat right. The field felt normal when I drove it the next morning. The flattened oval had puffed back up like nothing had happened. No footprints, no sign of a person. The only remnant was a thin copper taste in my mouth that didn't belong to coffee. I kept the footage backed up on 2 drives and read the forums, because that is what you do. People argued about paranormal and technical possibilities with equal conviction. Some others had found oddness in their cameras that same night, scattered in towns a few counties over. Nobody had an answer. I started checking the field at odd times, an hour before dawn, an hour after sunset. Sometimes the air would feel like someone had exhaled near my ear. Sometimes it would be just wind and the smell of cut grass. 4 nights later, a grain truck rolled down the road at 2 in the morning, and the whole house woke with its rumble. I checked the feed, and the silhouette was gone. The drone battery that night drained normally, the file timestamps behaved, the world matched the clock. I still fly the drone, because there's always something to check. Fences rot, irrigation wheels seize, farm life nags at you if you don't look. But when I send the craft up now, I sit with my thumb hovering over the pause button, and the return to home like it's a lid on a jar. Gus watches the screen too sometimes, head tilted in that way that shows he hears more than he can tell. Every so often I scrub through the footage from that night and stop at 8:24 on the file and stare at the black shape in the middle of the field. The stubborn silhouette that has no name and no explanation, and I try to figure out whether I was in the truck or in the frame first. It was close to midnight when I left my buddy's place in Saratoga Springs. We'd been watching a game, had a few beers, and I was heading home to Corinth. It's maybe a half-hour drive, mostly through back roads lined with thick woods. The sky was clear, just a few stars visible between branches, and the air had that early spring chill where you can see your breath a little. The first 20 minutes were nothing unusual. Empty road, no headlights behind me, just the low hum of the tires and the occasional whine from the transmission when I hit a bump. I had the radio on low, some classic rock station out of Albany. But right after I turned onto Middle Grove Road, the signal cut out completely. Static. I fiddled with the tuner, tried a few different stations, nothing but white noise. Even the phone lost signal. I figured it was just one of those dead zones in the hills. A few minutes later, I saw light behind me. I thought it was another car catching up, so I checked the mirror, but it didn't look right. It wasn't the usual twin headlights, it was just one bright, almost pure white circle. Not bluish like LED headlights or yellow like halogens. It was clean, almost sterile looking, and it didn't bounce the way headlights do over uneven road. It stayed perfectly level. I slowed down a bit to let whoever it was pass, but the light didn't close the distance. It stayed maybe 100 yards behind, dead center in the lane. When I sped up, it matched my speed. When I slowed, it slowed. That's when I started getting uneasy. I pulled over once, pretending to check my GPS, thinking maybe I'd just let it pass, but when I stopped, it stopped too. The brightness didn't change, but it wasn't blinding, more like it was glowing through the trees. I rolled my window down to listen. No engine noise, no tires on gravel, nothing. After maybe 30 seconds, I put the car in drive and started rolling again. The light followed. I told myself it was probably some guy with a spotlight mounted on his truck screwing around. But then I realized the road was narrow, only one lane in each direction and winding. The way that light stayed perfectly steady dead center didn't make sense. Around that point, I came up on a dirt service road that led off into the woods. I'd passed it a few times before. It wasn't gated, just a rough path utility trucks use sometimes. I figured if someone was following me, I could pull down there, kill the lights, and see what they did. I turned onto it fast, tires crunching over gravel. The trees closed in almost immediately, branches brushing the roof. I drove maybe 50 feet in, cut the engine, and shut off my headlights. The forest went completely black. I sat still, barely breathing, watching the mirror. The white light slowed on the main road, then came to a stop. It didn't swing its beam around or search. It just hung there, completely motionless between the trees. I thought it was some kind of drone at first, but it was big, maybe the size of a car hood. The shape was hard to make out, but there was a faint edge to it, like a disc or oval. No sound at all. I waited. A minute passed, then 2. The light didn't move an inch. I remember turning my ignition key halfway, not to start the car, just enough to bring the dash lights on so I could glance at the clock. It was 12:23. I looked back. Still there. At some point, I realized I was gripping the steering wheel so hard my hands hurt. The light began to pulse very slowly, dimming just a little, then brightening again. Not rhythmic, like breathing almost. Something about that made my stomach flip. I turned the key the rest of the way, headlights back on, and reversed quickly, gravel kicking up. The second my tires hit the main road again, the light flickered, then shot upward. Straight up, not diagonally, just vertically, until it disappeared into the tree line above. No sound, no trail, just gone. I sat there in the middle of the road, heart racing, headlights pointed down an empty stretch of asphalt. I waited for another car to come by, but the road stayed empty. The rest of the drive home was quiet. The radio was still dead, even after I got closer to town. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the clock on the dashboard read 1:02. The drive from that turnoff shouldn't have taken more than 15 minutes. I went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and just listened to the refrigerator hum for a while. Around 1:20, I checked my phone, full bars, and the time matched the dash clock. No missed calls, no messages. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that white glow behind the trees. The next morning, I drove back out there. I stopped at the same spot on Middle Grove and looked down that service road. The entrance was muddy, tire tracks everywhere, but mine were still visible. You could see where I'd turned in, reversed out. Nothing else. I followed the dirt path on foot for maybe 100 feet just to see if there were any signs of someone else being there. There weren't. No footprints, no cigarette butts, no broken branches. But in one patch of soft ground, maybe halfway down, the soil was darker, or like it had been baked or burned. About a 6-foot circle, smooth around the edges, almost perfect. It didn't smell like smoke or fuel. It just looked wrong. The mud around it was still damp from the rain earlier that week, but that patch was completely dry, cracked even. I crouched down to touch it. The ground was warm, not hot, but noticeably warmer than the air. A car came up behind me on the main road, and I stood up fast. It was a county truck, probably a utility guy. He slowed down, saw me, and asked if everything was okay. I told him I'd seen a light out there the night before and wanted to make sure it wasn't someone camping illegally or something. He looked down the dirt path, squinted a bit, and said, "Yeah, people say they see stuff out here sometimes. Must be the base." When I asked what base, he said there used to be some kind of radar testing facility farther north back in the 70s, and maybe the military still used parts of it. I nodded, pretended that made sense, and left it at that. Driving home again in daylight felt strange. Everything looked normal, just pine trees, gray pavement, birds hopping along the shoulder. But every so often I'd glance in the rearview mirror and half expect that light to be there again. That night, I went to back up the dashcam footage from my car. It's one of those cheap ones that overwrites itself every few hours. The video from the drive started fine. Headlights, road, static on the radio. Then, right around when the radio cut out, the recording glitched. The next timestamp jumped forward 13 minutes. After that, it showed me turning into my driveway. There's no footage of the light. None. I tried not to obsess over it, but I kept thinking about that burned patch in the dirt. I went back again 2 days later, early in the morning this time. The ground was cold, damp from dew. The patch was still there, but fainter, like it had been fading. The edges were softer, less defined. I stood there for a while watching the trees. It was dead quiet, not even wind. For a second, I thought I saw something pale move between the trunks. Not light, exactly, more like a reflection that shouldn't have been there. Then a bird startled and flew off, and I realized how tense I'd been standing. I walked back to the car and drove home. I haven't been down that road at night since. The only strange thing after that was about a week later. I was coming out of work, and when I started my car, the radio, which had been fine all week, suddenly blared static again for about 10 seconds before the signal came back. It was that same station out of Albany. I didn't think much of it, but when I looked at the clock, the time had reset to 12:23. It started with the ceiling. I woke up at some point in the dark and lay there thinking I'd heard the house settle. Old cabins do that. But the underside of the roof didn't groan. Instead, there were shadows moving above me, like someone was passing a flashlight between their knees. Slow arcs, no hard edges, as if long arms were sweeping across the plaster. I sat up, pulled the blanket tighter, and listened. There was no wind, no rain, not even the far sound of a car. The curtains were closed over the single window. They were the heavy kind, lined, thick, meant to keep the cold out. The little brass latch was still locked. Nothing on the porch could have made shadows that big. I'm Rachel. I was alone in a rental cabin up in the Catskills for the week because my apartment in the city felt like someone else's life, and I needed something that didn't hum. The place was small. A wood stove, a kitchenette that had seen better days, books stacked like they were leaning for moral support. I'd picked it because the photos showed trees close enough to the windows to touch, and a creek you could hear in the background. The first night, everything was normal in a way that made normal feel like a privilege. I ate cold pizza, read a little, fell asleep to the thin cough of the stove. When the shadows started their quiet patrol across the ceiling, I waited for an obvious answer. Maybe the streetlight down the road was brighter that night. Maybe a neighbor had a spotlight. I told myself I'd be rational. I padded to the curtain, felt the latch, and wheeled the knob. It was locked, as I remembered, and the glass was dark and not showing headlights or any moving shape. The trees outside were thick and still. Their branches didn't tap the pane. The night was the kind that used to make me feel like a child, soft and enfolding. This thing felt different. It felt like someone had taken the ordinary night, cut a hole in it, and was shuffling cards through the gap. I turned on the bedside lamp. The shadows didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to move more distinctly against the patch of ceiling that the lamp didn't reach. That was the first time a real stupid fear made my mouth go dry. An image of someone, not a person exactly, but a shape, between the roof and the sky, playing with light. I clicked the lamp off again, and the ceiling went to the neutral dark everyone knows. Maybe I dozed off on my book and dreamed it. Maybe. I lay there for a while, and then, because I'm not brave, and because I like evidence, I got up and opened the door quietly. The hallway outside the bedroom smelled faintly of wood smoke, the kind that still felt like a promise rather than a threat. The rest of the cabin was dark. The kitchen clock glowed faintly. 2:13 a.m. The stovepipe clanked once like a polite horse, then settled. I padded to the living room where there's a second door that opens onto a small porch. The curtains there were also closed. I eased one aside and looked out into the night. Between the trunks of the pines there was a pale light drifting low, about treetop height. It wasn't bright, more awash like the skin of a moonless night lit by something clean and white. It hovered between the trunks and moved slowly from one gap in the trees to the next, as if someone carrying a lantern were walking along a path I couldn't see. There was no sound, no footsteps on gravel, no engine, nothing. The light didn't have a source you could point to. It was a liquid thing, rounder than a flashlight and smoother than a headlamp. It didn't flicker. It just drifted, and the way it crossed the trunks made long, soft shadows on the snow-dusted forest floor. I remember standing there with the curtain pinched between my fingers and feeling stupid for being afraid. There are a lot of things you can get used to in upstate New York. Deer in the yard, coyotes at dusk, people who lose their way and knock on the wrong cabin door, but this didn't fit. I grabbed my phone to take a picture, and the screen stuttered like a hiccup and then showed me the camera menu as if I just opened it. No preview. I tapped to take a picture, and the shutter sound froze halfway through, and then the file wouldn't save. My phone battery dropped visibly. Not 3%, then 2%. It dropped like a mini syndrome. It read 17% when the light was a few feet from the porch, and 9% after it slid past the far pines. That made me fourth guess myself. Was the battery terrible? Had I remembered the charge wrong? Even that felt like a small symptom of something else. For the next 20 minutes, I watched from the doorway. The light drifted along a line I couldn't trace, between trees, then back, then hesitated and swept slow arcs. The way the light moved made me think of someone reading the trunks like book pages, scanning them without touching. Eventually, it angled toward the creek, and then vanished behind a thicker stand of birch. I watched until I couldn't see any pale glow at all, then eased the curtain shut and got back into bed, hands shaking. Sleep didn't come easy after that. I lay awake thinking of insect noises that had stopped, the chirp of crickets, the far call of a barred owl. The yard had been too quiet when the light was there, like all the small life had paused the way you pause a record. Once, sometime after 3, I heard another thing, a single soft scrape near the side door, like someone dragging a foot over the gravel. I froze and listened, and then the scrape stopped. There was no second scrape and no sound of any vehicle pulling away. I didn't open the door. In the morning, the cabin looked normal in the harsh way things do after a night of oddness. Sun filtered through the curtains the same as always, the wood stove needed another stick of kindling, the coffee maker took too long to warm up. I tried to be practical, check the lock, check the windows, call the owner. The deadbolt and the latch on the porch were both in place just as I'd left them. There was no physical evidence of someone having been up on the roof or outside the house. But when I walked the perimeter with my sneakers and stood on the porch, there were impressions in the moss on the far side, shallow and too neat to be deer prints. They were almost like the outline of a boot but softer, as if whatever had made them had weight but not a heel. They started at the rock slab and trailed off into the ferns. I took two pictures. The camera on my phone showed plain green, and then a corrupted speck where the impressions were. I told the owner what I'd seen, and he laughed the cautious laugh of someone with property to protect. Probably a neighbor with one of those LED lanterns, he said, or some kids messing about. He offered to come up with a spare flashlight and to check his motion lights. I found myself not taking comfort in his explanation. The person I had seen in my doorway that night, if it had been a person, would have had to walk through a stretch of pines no one uses and not leave a proper trail. And the scratches, small, like the drag of something round, were the wrong shape for human feet. I stayed another night because I'm stubborn about plans and because, half meanly, I wanted to prove to myself it had been nothing. The second night was full of other strange little things that accumulated like beads on a string. My kitchen radio, which usually picks up distant NPR clear as a bell, shimmered into static for a full minute, and then came back on with a different host mid-sentence. The dog of a neighbor 2 cabins down barked hard at 1:45 a.m. and then didn't bark again for hours. My analog alarm clock reset itself to 12 at some time between midnight and dawn. By 3 in the morning, I was awake again. This time, when the shadows started across the bedroom ceiling, it felt like being under observation rather than in a story. The shape of the shadow was wrong, too long, and too slow. I turned on every light in the cabin, the kitchen, the living room, the sconces. The shadows still slid above like something outside had a strip of white paper and was running it gently across the roof. The lamp over the stove hummed and briefly dimmed, then brightened as if someone had changed a dial. My phone buzzed with one text from an unknown number that only read, "You should leave." There was no signature. I called the number and it went straight to voicemail. I packed my bag before dawn. I didn't tell the owner I was leaving early because the explanation I would have given, the cabin felt watched and the trees had footprints that weren't quite boots, sounded foolish in the polite light of morning. The drive down the mountain was slow because the road was narrow, and I kept glancing in the rear view at the trees. They looked normal enough. Trunks standing in a row, little branches catching sunlight. In the car, my phone booted itself 3 times like it had to reinitialize, and the battery settled back to what it had been when I'd left the city. I called my sister, who likes practical questions, and said I'd had a strange night. She asked if I'd had too much wine. I told her about the light and the ceiling and the soft prints. She told me to get home and not to go back. I did go home. The city noise is its own smothering thing, but it felt easier to live with than that dense, quiet attention in the woods. I slept in my bed properly that night, the city skyline throwing orange bands into my curtains, and I didn't see shadows crawl across any ceilings. I've told a few people, a friend from grad school who wants to believe in mysteries, and my neighbor who says it was probably a deer with a reflective collar, and neither had an answer. The only thing that stuck was how precise the moments were. A light that skimmed between trunks, shadows moving like slow hands, the odd small failures of electronics, the little trail of impressions that wasn't human. I could have chalked it up to nerves, to the loneliness of a week alone, to a battery dying at the wrong time. I could have accepted the owner's lantern theory, but the print shapes, the hum of the lamp in the kitchen, the way my phone dropped power faster when the light was near, those details sat in my head, sharp and small. I went back 2 months later with a friend who swore she wanted to see the place for herself. We walked the perimeter in daylight and found only normal things. Moss, a fox trail, the same rounded rocks. The impressions I'd seen had washed into the ground. The owner had installed a motion light that clicked on reliably when we tramped past. There was nothing left to make me certain of anything I hadn't lived. We sat on the porch with mugs and watched the trees. The air moved. The cabin was quiet in a regular way. Sometimes in the city, late when the building hums and the neighbor's radiator rattles like an old train, I'll stand at my window and look out at the line of apartment windows across the street and wonder what the house near the pines contains. I don't think I want that light to visit me again. I don't think I want whatever made those perfect slow shadows to come close. But a part of me, small and stubborn, still wonders what it was doing scanning the trees, what it read in the bark, and why it bothered to move the way it did. I made it home safe. I packed my bag. The details of that week stay with me in the practical, nagging way of things you can't quite put down. I was finishing the night shift at a security company in Buffalo, covering one of the older industrial parks along Riverside Drive. It's mostly empty warehouses now, a few of them rented out for storage, some abandoned for years. My routine was simple. Walk the perimeter every hour, check cameras, make notes, radio in every so often. Usually uneventful, and I preferred it that way. It was mid-September, one of those nights where the air is cool but humid, with a low cloud ceiling that made everything feel dim and pressed down. The streets outside were deserted, except for the occasional truck. Around 1:15 a.m., I was in the main office, reviewing the live feeds from cameras mounted on the roofs. I remember drinking my last cup of coffee and noticing that everything looked normal. Empty lots, a few blinking lights on the rooftops, shadows stretching from the old street lamps. Then I saw it. Camera 5, the one covering the north side of the complex, showed a bright light coming down over Warehouse 12. At first, I thought it was a reflection from one of the lampposts or maybe a truck's headlights, but there was nothing on the street. The light hovered just above the roof, completely still, and it wasn't yellow or white like normal bulbs. It was almost bluish-white, soft at the edges but intense in the middle, like someone had jammed a flashlight into a fog. I froze. I watched it for a good 30 seconds before I grabbed my radio to check with dispatch. "You seeing this?" I said, keeping my voice calm. No response. They must have been busy at another post. I called the front desk line. No answer. I realized I was alone in the building. The light pulsed once, then twice, very slowly, like it was breathing. I reached for the zoom on the camera, trying to get a closer look. The footage jumped a little, static interference maybe. But the light remained. What got me was that there was no source, no wires, no vehicle, no anything. The warehouse roof underneath was dark, nothing moving. I thought about heading outside to see it with my own eyes, but the feeling I can only describe as wrong hit me. It wasn't fear exactly, just uneasy, like the hairs on your arms standing up when something is off. I stayed inside and kept watching. After maybe 2 minutes, the light started to move. Not fast. It drifted a few feet forward, then hovered again. Then, without warning, it seemed to disappear frame by frame on the monitor. 1 second it was there, the next, fainter, then gone. I paused the feed and rewound it. Every frame I went back, it was the same, pulsing slightly, then fading. I grabbed my flashlight and walked toward the north exit, curiosity winning over caution. When I stepped outside, the parking lot was dark. The lamps overhead flickered from the humid air, and there was nothing. No glow, no noise, nothing. The buildings were empty, the ground dry, not a puddle or disturbance. I walked along the edge of Warehouse 12, shining the beam over the roof and walls. Nothing. No footprints, no tire marks, no evidence of anyone being there. The air smelled like ozone, though faint, just enough to notice if you stopped breathing for a moment. I don't think it lasted more than 30 seconds, but I remember stopping and just breathing, trying to process it. When I turned back to the office, my radio crackled. Dispatch was back online, asking if I was okay. I said yes, trying to keep my voice casual and didn't mention the light. I went back inside, rewound the camera feed again. I noticed something else, the timestamp. The light had been on camera for about 2 minutes, maybe a little more. I checked the wall clock. I had lost maybe 20 minutes. I don't know if I dozed off or what, but the sequence of events didn't match the clock. Trying to explain it rationally, I thought maybe it was a reflection, maybe an aircraft. But the light was too low for planes, and the airport radar shows nothing. Helicopters would make noise. Drones? Possible, but there's no way one could hover so close to those roofs without being noticed by anyone else, especially without lights or a sound. I kept an eye on the feed the rest of the night. Nothing else appeared. The rest of my rounds were quiet. I did my checks, wrote up the incident report in my log, only noting strange light on camera, no source identified, and headed home at 5:30 a.m. That morning, when I walked out to my car, the fog from the river hung low over the asphalt. The whole industrial park looked the same, old warehouses, cracked concrete, empty. I stopped at the gate for a moment, half expecting to see that blue-white glow again, but it never came. I tried telling my friend Greg, another guard, what happened. He laughed it off, said I was probably tired or seeing reflections. But when I showed him the footage, he got quiet. He said he didn't know what to make of it, but he agreed it was weird, the pulsing, the way it disappeared. I've gone back to that post a few times since, always at night, nothing. Cameras are fine, rounds are fine. I watch for the light, half hoping, half dreading it. Sometimes, when the mist rolls in from the river, I swear I catch a faint shimmer in the corner of my eye, just enough to make me pause, but it's gone before I can focus. I haven't told anyone else at work. Don't want them thinking I'm crazy. I keep the footage on my phone, but every time I look at it, I get that same uneasy feeling. It's like the light knows I'm watching, even if it's not really there anymore. The thing is, I'm not sure if I want to see it again. But at the same time, I can't stop thinking about it. That soft, pulsing, hovering glow in the middle of the empty warehouses, the way time seemed to stretch. It's one of those nights that just lingers. I still drive past Riverside Drive sometimes, late at night. The industrial park looks ordinary, dark, empty, silent. But every so often when the fog rolls in, I swear I see something flicker between the buildings. I tell myself it's just a trick of the lights, a reflection, my imagination. But I don't think it is. Not entirely. I woke up to the smell of damp pine and cold air, the kind that makes you pull your sleeping bag tighter even though you'd zipped it up all the way. My alarm had gone off at 5 a.m., but something made me open my eyes before it. At first, I thought I'd just rolled over in my sleep, but then I noticed the zipper on the tent flap. It wasn't fully closed. Not by much, just a finger-width gap at the top. I never leave it like that. I'm careful about bears and wind. And I was sure I'd zipped it all the way last night. I froze for a second, listening. Nothing. Just the faint rustle of the wind through the trees and the occasional bird starting its morning calls. My backpack, my boots, the food bag, all exactly where I'd left them. Everything inside the tent was untouched. I took a slow breath and unzipped the flap the rest of the way. That's when I noticed the footprints. At first, I thought a deer or maybe a raccoon had wandered close, but then I realized what was wrong. The footprints weren't random. They all pointed inward toward the center of my campsite where I'd slept. Some were small, some larger, but all of them led the same direction. They circled the tent, going around it, coming closer in places, and then fading off a few feet away. There were no prints leading outward from the circle, only inward. I stepped out of the tent, boots crunching on the frosted grass. The morning fog clung to the lower slopes of the mountains, softening the light from the rising sun. Everything looked normal, quiet. I scanned the surrounding trees. Nothing. No deer, no hikers, nothing that could have made prints that precise. I walked the perimeter of the tent slowly, my eyes tracing each track. I couldn't find a logical pattern to the spacing. Some prints were close together, others farther apart, but the direction never wavered. Every single one pointed at the tent. My mind started running through possibilities. Someone could have been here in the night, maybe a prankster, but the nearest trail was miles away, and I hadn't seen another camper anywhere nearby. My friends weren't supposed to be arriving until the next day, and if someone had been sneaking around my tent, why leave no footprints leading away? I tried to remember my own movements from the night. I didn't remember getting up at all. No nightmares, no half-waking wanderings, and my flashlight, which I keep under my pillow, was still there. I checked my pack, everything intact. My food bag was still zipped and hung from the tree like I left it. I crouched and examined the prints again. Some of the smaller ones had an almost human-like shape, but too thin, almost elongated. Others were broader, rounder, more like a boot. None matched any of my own shoes or the boots I had in my car. I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. I debated packing up and leaving, but the fog was thick, the trails muddy. I decided to sit back on the log I'd left by the fire pit, trying to calm my racing thoughts. My coffee thermos was empty from last night, and I absent-mindedly opened it, expecting just water. It was still empty, as it should be, but the metal felt strangely cold in my hands. The sun rose higher, burning a little through the fog, and the forest came alive. Birds started chirping, squirrels chattered, and somewhere a stream gurgled. Everything looked normal. Normal enough that I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the footprints, that maybe the frost had created odd impressions in the dirt. Almost. I packed slowly, my mind wandering back to the tracks. The circle, it wasn't perfect, but the way it curved, the spacing, the inward focus, it didn't seem random. Like someone or something had been studying me while I slept, moving in a calculated way. I double-checked the tent before taking it down. Nothing else was missing. Everything from last night was exactly as I'd left it. My pack, my boots, even the little notebook I keep in the side pocket. The thought of someone or something walking around me while I slept, watching, without leaving any other trace, it made my stomach tighten. As I started down the trail toward my car, the fog slowly lifting, I kept glancing back over my shoulder. Every time I thought I saw movement, it vanished into the mist. The mountains were quiet, peaceful, but I could feel it in the air. That same tension from the night, the sense of being observed. I drove out of the parking area without seeing anyone on the trail, and by the time I hit the highway, the sun was fully out, burning off the fog. I told myself it was probably nothing, an animal, a trick of the frost and shadows, but I couldn't shake the feeling of those tracks circling my tent, the way they all led inward like a geometric pattern pointing at where I'd slept. Later that week, I told a friend about it over a call. He joked about mountain spirits or my imagination. I laughed along, but the memory of that circle stayed with me. The way the prints seemed deliberate, the way the night had felt heavier near the tent, almost patient. I went back to the same campsite months later with my friends. Everything was normal. No mysterious footprints, no strange air, no sense of being watched. But the memory lingered, especially when I camp alone. I keep my flashlight close, my tent zipped, and I check the ground around me. Sometimes at night, I imagine the footprints forming in the frost, circling the tent again, moving inward silently while I sleep. And though I can't explain it, I feel like something out there, maybe just a trick of nature, maybe something else, Knows I'm here before I even wake up. It was late autumn when it happened. Cold enough that the radiators in my flat clicked and hissed most nights, but not yet winter. I'd been on the local radio a few days earlier, one of those casual call-in segments they run when the news is slow. I only phoned because the host Graham was talking about odd things people had seen in the sky. I figured, why not? 2 weeks before that call, I'd seen something strange walking home from the pub. I cut across the park near the canal, and when I looked up, there was this line of lights hanging low and moving slowly. Not a plane. I know what planes look like, and this was too quiet, too close, and the lights weren't in any configuration I recognized. It was like 6 or 7 spheres glowing white, shifting around as if they were connected by something invisible. I stood there for maybe 30 seconds before they tilted and slid off behind the clouds. No sound, no trail, just gone. That was basically what I told Graham on the radio, a short, clumsy description of lights in the sky. Nothing dramatic. He joked about me needing another pint, the usual. I hung up, and that was the end of it, or so I thought. 3 nights later, I heard a knock at my door. It was around 10:30. I wasn't expecting anyone, and I don't usually get visitors that late. At first, I thought maybe it was the downstairs neighbor again complaining about noise, but when I opened the door, there was a man standing there I'd never seen before. He was tall, easily 6'2", and dressed in a black suit with a white shirt buttoned all the way up. No tie, though. His skin was pale, his face narrow, hair dark and combed flat against his head. He looked older than me, maybe early 40s, but it was hard to pin down. What stood out most were his eyes. Not the color, they were a dark brown, but the way he held them on me. Unblinking, fixed, like he wasn't entirely sure how eye contact worked, but was forcing it. "Mr. Harker?" he asked. That's my name, so I nodded. He didn't offer a hand or introduce himself. He just stood there in the doorway until I stepped aside out of politeness. He walked in slowly, like he was measuring each step. I asked what this was about, but he didn't answer right away. He stopped in the middle of the living room, glanced at the books on my shelf, the half-empty glass of water on the table, and the pile of unopened mail. Then he turned to me and said, very calmly, "You described lights in the sky. I would like to know about the patterns of sound you noticed." The way he said it, it wasn't a question. More like he was reminding me of something. But I hadn't mentioned sound. Not on the radio, not to anyone. The whole point was how quiet the thing had been. I told him that. I said there wasn't any sound. That's what made it so odd. He tilted his head like he didn't quite believe me. No hum, no resonance, not even a vibration. His words were slow, deliberate, like he'd rehearsed them. Again, I told him no, just lights. That was it. He stared at me for what felt like too long, then sat down in my armchair without asking. His movements were stiff, like he was imitating how people sit but hadn't practiced much. He folded his hands on his knees and asked me to describe the exact arrangement of the lights. I did my best, but he kept interrupting to ask if they pulsed in sequence, if they overlapped, if the brightness shifted in cycles. Those were his words, pulses and cycles. I started to feel uneasy. He wasn't threatening exactly, but something about the way he focused on these details, especially the ones I hadn't even thought about, made me nervous. He wasn't writing anything down either. No notebook, no phone, nothing. Just sitting there, staring and asking questions. At one point he asked if I'd had any unusual dreams since the sighting. That threw me. I said no, not really, but the truth is I'd been waking up in the middle of the night for no reason, just sitting upright in bed, heart racing, no memory of what I'd been dreaming about. I didn't tell him that. After maybe 20 minutes, he stood up abruptly. No goodbye, no thank you. He just said, "If you notice the sounds, you will know what they mean." Then he walked to the door, opened it himself, and stepped into the hallway. I followed him out, more to make sure he was leaving than anything. He went down the stairs slowly, again in that careful, almost mechanical way. I leaned over the railing, and by the time he reached the bottom, I expected to hear the front door open. But there was nothing. No creak of the hinges, no slam, just silence. I waited a full minute, then went down after him. The entryway was empty. The street outside was quiet, just one car parked under the lamp. No sign of him walking away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, especially that line, the patterns of sound. It was like he knew something I didn't. The more I thought about it, the more I wondered if maybe there had been a sound that night in the park, something too faint for me to register. Or maybe he was planting the idea in my head on purpose. The strangest part came a week later. I was brushing my teeth with the bathroom window cracked open when I heard this low, steady hum. At first, I thought it was the boiler or maybe traffic from the main road, but it wasn't. It was deeper, more even, almost like standing next to an electric transformer, except it was coming from outside, not inside. I turned off the tap and just stood there, listening. The hum went on for maybe a minute, then faded out completely. I ran to the window and looked down at the street. Nothing unusual. Just the same cars, the same empty pavement. I never saw the man again,